Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The ad on Craigslist seemed perfect for someone drowning in student loans like me. $400 a month for a room in a house near campus, utilities included, with 3 other roommates to split the common areas. I'd just turned 23 that April, and after burning through most of my savings on textbooks and ramen, this place felt like a miracle. The landlord, Walter Garrison, met me at the front door on move-in day with a clipboard and a grin that stretched too wide across his face. He walked me through the house, pointing out the thermostat I shouldn't touch, the dishwasher that only worked on the light cycle, and the basement door at the end of the hallway. "Storage down there," he said, jangling his keys. "Each tenant gets a section, but that back room stays locked. Just old tools and equipment from when my father owned the place." I didn't think much about it those first few weeks. Between my nursing program clinicals and my part-time job at the campus bookstore, I barely had time to sleep, let alone worry about locked doors and basements. My roommates were decent enough people who kept to themselves. There was Bradley, an engineering student who lived on energy drinks and barely left his room. Natalie, who worked nights at a call center and slept during the day. And Jerome, who was finishing his MBA and spent most weekends at his girlfriend's place. We crossed paths in the kitchen occasionally, nodded politely, and went about our lives. The house had that weird quality old rentals have, where every floorboard announces your presence, and the walls seem too thin for privacy, but somehow you still feel alone. My room sat directly above the basement, second door on the right from the stairs, with a window that faced the neighbor's fence, and let in exactly 45 minutes of sunlight each afternoon. The coughing started on a Monday night in early October. I remember because I'd just submitted a huge pharmacology paper and was finally allowing myself 8 hours of sleep for the first time in weeks. Around 2 in the morning, this dry, rasping sound pulled me from a dream about missing an exam. At first, I thought it was Bradley down the hall, maybe catching a cold from all those late nights. But as I lay there in the dark, tracking the sound, I realized it was coming from below. Not just below, but directly beneath my bed. The cough had a muffled quality to it, like someone trying to suppress the noise by covering their mouth with fabric or their arm. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, these horrible wheezing bursts that made my chest hurt just listening to them, and then nothing. Complete silence except for the house settling and Natalie's alarm clock going off down the hall for her 3 a.m. shift. The next morning, I caught Walter in the driveway as he was leaving after fixing the garage door. "Hey, quick question," I said, trying to sound casual while holding my coffee mug like a shield between us. "Is there any way someone could be in the basement at night? I heard some weird noises." He barely glanced up from his phone, already walking toward his truck, a beat-up Ford with a cracked windshield and bumper stickers from 3 different political campaigns. "Probably the water heater," he said, climbing into the driver's seat. "Thing's older than you are, makes all kinds of racket when it kicks on. Had it checked last month, completely safe, just noisy." He pulled out before I could mention that water heaters don't usually cough, and I stood there in my pajama pants and oversized sweatshirt, feeling stupid for even asking. For 3 nights, nothing happened. I started to convince myself that maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing, or that sound travels weird in old houses, or that Bradley really did have a cold, and the acoustics just made it seem like it came from below. But that Friday, around midnight, the coughing returned. This time it went on for almost 5 minutes, these wet, desperate sounds that made me think of my grandfather in his last days at the hospice where I'd done my first clinical rotation. I grabbed my phone and recorded it, pressing the device against the floor to catch every wheeze and gasp. When I played it back with headphones, I could hear something else between the coughs, a rustling, like papers or plastic bags being moved around, and what might have been the squeak of old mattress springs. I sent the recording to Jerome since he was the only roommate I'd really talked to, and he responded immediately, even though it was past midnight. "That's definitely not the water heater. We should check it out." Jerome met me in the hallway 5 minutes later, holding a flashlight he'd grabbed from his car and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. We crept down to the basement like teenagers sneaking out after curfew, testing each step to avoid the creaky spots. The basement was exactly what you'd expect from a rental house built in the 70s. Concrete floors, exposed beams, that particular smell of damp cardboard and forgotten things. Our storage sections were clearly marked with masking tape and Sharpie, each tenant's name in Walter's blocky handwriting. Behind a wall of stacked boxes and an old refrigerator that hummed constantly, we could see the locked door. A padlock the size of my fist secured a metal latch that had been added recently, judging by the fresh scratch marks on the worn wood. Jerome aimed his flashlight at the gap beneath the door, and we both saw it at the same time. A thin strip of light, barely visible, like someone inside had a phone charging or a nightlight plugged in. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds, just staring at that sliver of light. Then, as if responding to our presence, the light shifted. A shadow passed across it, the unmistakable shape of feet moving on the other side. Jerome grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks, and we both scrambled backward, nearly knocking over a tower of Christmas decoration boxes. Neither of us said anything until we were back upstairs in the kitchen, where Jerome poured himself a glass of water with shaking hands and downed it in one go. "We're calling the cops," he said, already pulling out his phone. But I stopped him, some ridiculous part of my brain still thinking about lease agreements and security deposits and having to find a new place in the middle of the semester. "Let me try Walter one more time," I said. "If he doesn't give me a real answer, then we call." Jerome looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but he put his phone down and waited while I sent Walter a text with the video attached, telling him we knew someone was in the locked room and we needed answers now. Walter showed up 20 minutes later, which should have been my first red flag since he lived 40 minutes away. He was wearing sweatpants and a faded college hoodie, his hair sticking up like he'd just rolled out of bed, but his eyes were wide awake and darting between Jerome and me like he was calculating something. "You kids are being paranoid," he said. But his voice had this thin quality to it, stretched tight like a wire about to snap. "That room's been locked for years. Nobody could possibly be in there." I pulled up the video on my phone, turned the volume all the way up and played the coughing sounds. His face went through this series of expressions, from dismissive to concerned to something I couldn't quite read. "Fine," he finally said, pulling out his keys with dramatic reluctance. "I'll show you there's nothing in there but rusty tools and spider webs, and then I don't want to hear about this again." He started toward the basement stairs, then stopped and turned back to us. "Actually, wait here. Insurance liability and all that. I'll go check and come right back." Jerome and I looked at each other and simultaneously decided we weren't letting him go alone. We followed him down, our footsteps echoing his on the wooden stairs. Walter kept muttering under his breath, something about ungrateful tenants and market-rate rentals, but his hands were trembling as he fumbled with the padlock. The key stuck, and he had to jiggle it 3 times before the lock finally clicked open. He pushed the door inward, and the smell hit us immediately. Not decay or waste, but that concentrated human smell of unwashed clothes and stale breath and something medicinal, like cough syrup or benzocaine lozenges. The room was maybe 8 by 10 feet, with a camping cot pushed against one wall, a battery-powered lantern on an overturned milk crate, and grocery bags lined up along another wall. Empty soup cans were stacked in a corner next to a pile of pill bottles. But the worst part was the ceiling. Someone had drilled tiny holes in precise spots, each one positioned perfectly to look up into the rooms above, into our bedrooms, into our lives. "Oh God," Walter said, and for the first time he seemed genuinely shocked. "Gordon, what have you done?" That's when we heard the toilet flush from the small bathroom. I hadn't even noticed in the corner, just a toilet and sink behind a curtain made from a shower liner. A man emerged, probably in his 50s, wearing a dingy white undershirt and jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He had Walter's same narrow face but none of his nervous energy, just this hollow resignation like he'd been caught doing something inevitable. "I told you they'd find out," Gordon said to Walter, not even looking at Jerome and me. "Told you the girl's room was too close. She was bound to hear me." He sat down on the cot with a wheeze that turned into another coughing fit, this one lasting almost a minute while Walter stood there with his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. When Gordon finally stopped coughing, he looked directly at me for the first time, and his eyes had this horrible apologetic quality that made my skin prickle. "You take morning showers at 6:15, he said quietly. "Sometimes you sing that song about the astronaut. Pretty voice." Jerome already had his phone out, calling 911 while backing toward the door. I couldn't move, couldn't process that this man, Gordon, had been living beneath me for months, watching through those horrible little holes, knowing my schedule better than I did. Walter started babbling, trying to explain that Gordon was his brother, that he'd lost his job and then his apartment, that it was supposed to be temporary, just a few weeks until he got back on his feet. "He's sick," Walter kept saying, as if that explained everything. "He's got respiratory problems, can't afford doctors. I couldn't just leave him on the street." But Gordon wasn't listening to his brother's excuses. He was looking at the holes in the ceiling with this weird pride, running his fingers along the wood. "Had to be real careful with the placement," he said to no one in particular. "Quarter-inch bit, just enough to see through but not enough for anyone to notice from above. The one over your desk is my favorite. You study so hard, writing all those notes about medications and patient care. Sometimes I pretend you're taking care of me." The police arrived within 10 minutes. 3 cars with lights but no sirens. They took Gordon away first, and he went without resistance, just asked Walter to grab his medications from the milk crate. The officers photographed everything, measured the holes, bagged the empty food containers and pill bottles. One of them, a woman with sergeant stripes, told us we'd all need to give statements, and that the house would be off limits for at least 48 hours while they processed the scene. Walter they arrested too, for criminal facilitation and endangerment. As they led him to the squad car, he kept trying to catch my eye, maybe wanting forgiveness or understanding, but I stared at the ground until the car door slammed shut. Jerome and I sat on the front steps until our other roommates got home. Then we all went to Bradley's girlfriend's apartment, cramming into her living room with sleeping bags and the weird energy of survivors from the same disaster. None of us ever went back to that house except to get our belongings with a police escort. I found a studio apartment the next week that cost twice as much and had terrible water pressure. But the floors were solid concrete and there was no basement, and that was all that mattered. The closing papers for my house came through on a Wednesday morning in late February, and honestly, I should have trusted my gut when the real estate agent kept adjusting her glasses and clearing her throat during the final walkthrough. But after 6 months of crashing on my sister's couch following the divorce, any place with my own walls felt like salvation. The house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac in Riverside Heights, one of those neighborhoods where people still put up seasonal decorations and kids actually played in the yards. Built in 1978, the split level had good bones underneath the outdated wallpaper and worn carpet, nothing that some sweat equity couldn't fix. What really sold me was the price, almost $40,000 under market value, because the previous owner, an elderly woman named Dorothy Brennan, had died in the master bedroom and the family wanted a quick sale. Death didn't bother me. At my age, having just watched my 10-year marriage flatline, I figured I could handle sharing space with whatever energy Dorothy left behind. My first 2 weeks there passed in a blur of unpacking boxes and making lists of everything that needed fixing, from the leaky kitchen faucet to the wood paneling in the den that belonged in a time capsule. The basement became my designated storage area for things I wasn't ready to deal with yet, mostly photo albums and wedding gifts that felt too complicated to sort through. It was your typical unfinished basement, concrete floors and exposed beams, with an ancient furnace that groaned like it was digesting something whenever it kicked on. That's what I told myself when I first heard the noises anyway. Just the furnace doing its 45-year-old furnace thing. The sounds usually started around 2 in the morning, these soft creaking noises that drifted up through the heating vents. Old houses make noise, everyone knows that. And after living in a modern apartment complex where I could hear my neighbor's coffee maker through the walls, a few creaks seemed like a fair trade for actual privacy. Everything changed on a Sunday night in March when I went down to grab my winter boots from storage, because the weather guy promised one last snowstorm before spring. The pull-string light barely reached the corners of the basement, casting these long shadows behind the water heater and the massive boiler that looked like something from a submarine movie. Behind the boiler, tucked into a gap between the unit and the wall, I found 3 Marlboro red cigarette butts arranged in a neat little line on the concrete floor. My whole body went rigid, like when you miss a step going downstairs and your stomach does that horrible flip. Nobody in my family smoked, hadn't had a single visitor who smoked, and the home inspector definitely would have mentioned finding cigarette butts during his inspection. Right next to the butts sat a Poland Spring water bottle, the label peeled halfway off, with maybe 2 inches of water still sloshing around inside. The plastic was soft, like someone had been gripping it recently, and when I picked it up with my sleeve pulled over my hand, the water inside was room temperature, not the icy cold you'd expect from something abandoned in a basement for weeks. I told myself Dorothy's family must have left it when they cleared out her belongings, maybe took smoke breaks while sorting through 40 years of accumulated stuff, even though the house had been empty for 3 months before I moved in. But that night, I barely slept, jerking awake every time the heat kicked on or a tree branch scraped the siding. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had him install new deadbolts on every exterior door, the expensive kind that couldn't be picked by some YouTube tutorial. Then I went through every window in the house, checking locks and adding these metal security bars to the basement windows that the guy at Home Depot assured me would stop anyone bigger than a raccoon. For good measure, I started leaving lights on when I went to bed. The kitchen, the hallway. Sometimes the basement too, my electric bill be damned. But even with all that, I kept finding myself standing at the top of the basement stairs at random times, listening for sounds that didn't belong, my hand hovering over the light switch like I was afraid of what I might see if I turned it on. 2 weeks passed without incident, and I had almost convinced myself that I'd overreacted, that living alone after a decade of marriage had made me jumpy and paranoid about normal house stuff. Then came the morning I found my back door unlocked, the one that led from the kitchen to the backyard, the one I specifically remembered checking twice before bed because it had become part of my nightly ritual, along with testing every window latch. The door was still closed, just unlocked. The deadbolt turned to the open position like someone had used a key. My coffee mug slipped right out of my hand, shattering on the linoleum and sending hot coffee across my bare feet. But I barely felt the burn. I grabbed my phone and almost called 911. But what would I say? That my door was unlocked and maybe I was just losing my mind from stress. Instead, I called my brother Kevin, who lived 40 minutes away. And while I waited for him to show up, I sat in my car in the driveway with the engine running, watching my own house like it might suddenly reveal its secrets. Kevin spent 2 hours going through the house with me, checking every closet, every corner, even the crawl space above the garage that required a ladder to access. We found nothing missing, nothing disturbed, just that unlocked door that he suggested might be a faulty mechanism, or maybe I'd forgotten despite being certain, absolutely certain, that I'd checked it. But when we went down to the basement to check the window locks, we found something that made Kevin stop talking mid-sentence about getting me a security system. Behind the boiler, in that same spot where I'd found the cigarettes, sat a McDonald's bag, grease-stained and crumpled, with a receipt dated from the previous night at 11:47 p.m. Inside were the remnants of a Big Mac meal, half-eaten, the fries still soft like they'd been sitting there for just a few hours. The smell hit us both at the same time, that distinctive fast food smell that definitely hadn't been there when I'd done laundry in the basement 2 days earlier. Kevin's face went pale, and he pulled out his phone to call the police while ushering me back upstairs, his hand on my back like he was afraid something might grab me if we didn't move fast enough. The police treated it like a standard break-in at first. Two officers who looked barely older than my nephew taking notes while walking through the house with their hands resting on their utility belts. They found the point of entry within 10 minutes, a basement window on the north side of the house where someone had carefully removed the security bar screws from the outside, the holes hidden behind a rhododendron bush that grew thick against the foundation. The frame showed fresh tool marks where someone had pried it open repeatedly, probably over several nights, working the lock mechanism until they'd figured out how to pop it silently. Officer Ramirez, the one with a thin scar through his left eyebrow, showed me how the intruder had been replacing the screws each time they left, making everything look normal from a casual glance. They documented everything, took photos, dusted for prints around the window and the boiler area, but both officers kept exchanging these looks that made my chest feel tight. When I asked what would happen next, Officer Carson, the younger one with freckles across his nose, said they'd increase patrols in the neighborhood, but admitted that without cameras or witnesses, catching someone who only came at night would be like finding a specific fish in Lake Superior. That afternoon, I spent $300 I didn't really have on security cameras from Best Buy, the kind that sent alerts to your phone when they detected motion. Kevin helped me set them up, one at each entrance, one in the hallway, and two in the basement, including one pointed directly at that window. We also moved my bedroom furniture so my bed sat against the far wall with clear sight lines to both the door and window, and Kevin insisted on installing this metal security bar that wedged under the doorknob, said he'd seen it on some crime show and it actually worked. Before he left, he tried to convince me to stay at his place for a while, but his wife had just had their third kid, and their house was already chaos without adding my drama to it. Instead, I promised to call him every night before bed and first thing in the morning, our own little check-in system that made us both feel better, even though we knew it wouldn't actually stop anything from happening. That first night with the cameras, I sat up in bed with my laptop open, watching the feeds like they were the most important TV show ever made, jumping every time a moth flew past the lens or the timestamp updated. For 3 nights, nothing happened except for a stray cat that triggered the basement camera and nearly gave me a heart attack at 3 a.m. when my phone started buzzing with motion alerts. I'd actually started to relax a little, thinking maybe the police visit had scared whoever it was away, that they'd moved on to some other house without cameras and paranoid owners who checked their locks 15 times before bed. Then on Friday night, exhausted from a week of barely sleeping, I made the mistake of taking 2 Benadryl to knock myself out, figuring the camera alerts would wake me if anything happened. I woke up Saturday morning feeling groggy and disoriented, my mouth dry like I'd been breathing through it all night, and when I checked my phone, there were 14 motion alerts from between 1:47 a.m. and 4:33 a.m. My fingers shook so bad I could barely unlock my phone, and when I finally got the camera app open, what I saw made me run to the bathroom and throw up the nothing that was in my stomach, just bile that burned my throat while tears streamed down my face. The footage showed a man entering through the basement window at 1:47 a.m., moving with the kind of confidence that comes from practice, like he'd done this so many times he could navigate my basement in the dark. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low and what looked like a maintenance company jacket, the kind with reflective stripes that made him look like he belonged there if anyone happened to glance through a window. The infrared camera made his eyes look like white circles as he walked directly to the stairs, not hesitating, not searching, just walking like he owned the place. The hallway camera caught him at 2:15 a.m., standing at my bedroom door, his hand on the knob, just standing there for a full 4 minutes without moving. And I realized with horror that he was listening to me breathe, waiting to see if I was truly asleep. Then he opened the door so slowly that it took another 2 minutes for it to fully open and disappeared into my room where I didn't have a camera because who puts a camera in their own bedroom? The next footage was him leaving my room at 3:58 a.m., walking backward while carefully closing the door, and in his hand was my phone charger, the pink one with the butterfly sticker that I'd been looking for all week, assuming I'd misplaced it somewhere. I called 911 while still sitting on my bathroom floor, barely able to form words through the sobbing. And this time they sent 3 patrol cars and a detective named Heather Novak, who had this way of making me feel like she actually believed every word I said. When she watched the footage, she immediately recognized something I'd missed in my panic: a small tattoo on the man's left hand, a distinctive pattern that looked like interlocking triangles. She asked me about previous maintenance work on the house, and suddenly, it clicked. The property management company that handled the rental before Dorothy bought it had sent someone to service the boiler just 2 months before she died. Detective Novak made some calls, and within an hour, she had a name: Carl Brenner, 43 years old, who'd been fired from Citywide Property Services 8 months ago for complaints about entering rental properties without notice. The company still had his photo on file, and even though the baseball cap obscured most of his face in my footage, that hand tattoo was unmistakable, those same interlocking triangles he'd apparently gotten during his time in the military, according to his employment records. They arrested Carl that same afternoon at his apartment in Fairfield, just 12 miles from my house, and what they found there made Detective Novak call me personally to come to the station, warning me I might want to bring someone for support. In a back room that Carl used as an office, they found hundreds of photos printed from a computer: photos of me sleeping, photos of me cooking dinner, photos of me watching TV on my couch, all taken from inside my house over the past month. But mixed in with mine were other photos, other women in other houses, some dating back 2 years, each set labeled with addresses and dates in neat handwriting on manila folders. He had keys to 17 different properties, including mine, which he'd apparently copied during his maintenance visits, and a notebook where he documented the routines of each house's occupants: when they slept, when they showered, when they were away at work. Detective Novak said in her 15 years on the force, she'd never seen anything quite like it. This methodical invasion of privacy that wasn't about theft or assault, but something else. Some need to exist in other people's spaces without their knowledge, to watch them in their most vulnerable moments. Carl never said a word during interrogation, just sat there with this blank expression, and eventually asked for a lawyer, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecutor charged him with multiple counts of breaking and entering, stalking, and criminal trespass. The trial happened 6 months later, and by then I'd already moved back in with my sister, unable to sleep in that house even after changing every lock and installing an alarm system that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. During the proceedings, we learned that Carl had been doing this since his divorce in 2017, starting with his ex-wife's apartment, then expanding to places he'd serviced during his maintenance job. The prosecutor brought in a psychologist who testified about voyeuristic disorders and violation of privacy as a form of control, using words like parasitic intimacy that made everyone in the courtroom shift uncomfortably in their seats. 16 other women came forward to testify, each with their own version of my story: finding cigarette butts, missing small items, that persistent feeling that someone had been in their space. One woman from Oak Harbor broke down completely when she described finding an impression on her bed's comforter, where someone had laid down next to her while she slept, the shape still visible when she woke up one morning. Carl got 11 years in state prison, eligible for parole and 7 with good behavior, which seems like nothing compared to the life sentence he gave all of us, who can't look at an unlocked door or a basement window without remembering. I sold the house 3 months after the trial, taking a $15,000 loss just to be free of it, and the realtor had to disclose the stalking incident to potential buyers, which meant it sat on the market for 4 months before a young couple from out of state bought it, probably thinking they were getting a deal. Sometimes I drive by there, not intentionally, but that neighborhood sits between my sister's place and the grocery store I like, and I see they've painted it yellow, added a garden, normal life continuing in a space that still shows up in my nightmares. The thing that stays with me most isn't even the violation itself, but this one detail from the trial, where they showed a photo from Carl's apartment of a coffee mug he'd taken from my kitchen, my favorite one with a cartoon cat that said "Coffee right meow," sitting on his kitchen counter like it belonged there. He'd been drinking from it every morning while looking at those photos of me, creating this twisted parallel life where he inhabited my spaces even when he wasn't physically there. And that image haunts me more than any footage of him standing in my bedroom doorway, because it means that even when I thought I was alone and safe, some part of my life was always bleeding into his. September in that basement apartment felt like hiding from the world, which was exactly what I needed. Willow Drive wasn't much to look at, just rows of old houses converted into rentals, but at $600 a month I couldn't complain. 29 candles on my last birthday cake, and here I was, starting fresh after Janet and I called it quits. The landlord, an older guy named Frank, lived upstairs with his wife and kept to himself mostly. During move-in day, the neighbor from next door, Gregory, appeared at my door offering to help with the heavy stuff. He was probably in his 50s, thin guy with calloused hands, said he worked night shifts at some warehouse across town. Made a joke about how our basements were identical, just mirror images of each other, while we struggled to angle my couch down those narrow stairs. Even offered to lend me tools if I needed anything fixed, which seemed neighborly enough at the time. After about 2 weeks of living there, small things in my kitchen started seeming out of place. My coffee mug would be turned handle left when I always left it handle right. The wooden spoon I kept in the drawer next to the stove would migrate to the drawer by the sink. A jar of peanut butter I swore I'd pushed to the back of the cabinet would be sitting at the front edge when I got home from my accounting job downtown. Figured my brain was still scrambled from the divorce stress, especially since I was surviving on maybe 4 hours of sleep a night, scrolling through apartment listings for something better while trying to rebuild my savings. Started doubting myself, even wrote notes about where I put things. The kitchen was cramped, maybe 8 feet by 6 feet, old appliances that hummed too loud, cracked linoleum that curled at the edges. Then came that Wednesday in October when things got harder to explain away. Left for work at 7:30 sharp like always, and I specifically remember washing my breakfast bowl and placing it upside down on the dish rack. When I got home around 6 that evening, the bowl was right side up with 3 drops of water pooled at the bottom, not just moved but used. The dish soap bottle had shifted from the left side of the sink to the right, and there was a different sponge on the counter, still damp. Called Frank immediately, asked if he'd sent someone down for maintenance, or if maybe his wife had needed to check something. He sounded confused, said nobody had any reason to enter my apartment, reminded me I had the only key besides his emergency copy, which was hanging in his kitchen where it always stayed. That night I couldn't settle down. Kept getting up to double-check the deadbolt, even wedged a chair under the doorknob like my dad used to do when we stayed in sketchy motels during road trips. Around 2 in the morning, lying there in the dark, listening to the furnace cycle on and off, I heard something that made my whole body go rigid. The distinct sound of a drawer sliding open in my kitchen, that specific sticky catch the silverware drawer made because of the humidity. Then the soft rattle of utensils followed by the drawer rolling shut. My bedroom was only about 15 feet from the kitchen, just a thin wall between us. I held my breath, phone already in my hand, thumb hovering over the emergency call button. Could hear my pulse hammering in my ears while I waited, listening for footsteps, for any other sound. Another drawer opened, the one with the heavier sound, where I kept the dish towels and oven mitts. The intruder was methodical, unhurried, like someone familiar with the layout. I pressed 911, whispered to the dispatcher that someone was in my apartment, gave the address twice to make sure she got it right. She told me to stay where I was, keep the door locked, officers were on their way. But then I heard something that made no sense at all. The microwave door opened and closed, followed by the beep of buttons being pressed, but no hum of it actually running. Just someone pressing buttons in the dark. The fridge opened next, that broken seal making its characteristic sucking sound, and I could hear containers being shifted around, the clink of glass jars touching. The sirens came within 8 minutes, though it felt like hours lying there listening to someone moving through my kitchen, like they owned it. When the red and blue lights started flashing through those ground-level windows, the sounds stopped instantly. Not gradually, not with footsteps running away, just stopped like someone had hit a switch. The officers knocked loud, announcing themselves, and I practically ran to let them in, explaining about the sounds, pointing toward the kitchen. 2 of them went in with flashlights while a third stayed with me by the door. They checked everything, the closets, the bathroom, behind the water heater, even looked up at the ceiling tiles. The kitchen drawers were all closed, nothing visibly out of place, but I knew someone had been there. The younger officer, Officer Daniels, according to his badge, started asking about windows, pointing out that they were all locked from the inside with no signs of tampering. The door showed no damage either, deadbolt still solid. The older cop, Officer Ruiz, was running his flashlight along the walls, checking for any openings, when he stopped at the back corner of my bedroom. There was a section of wood paneling that looked slightly different from the rest, the grain pattern not quite matching. He pushed on it, and it gave way slightly, like it wasn't properly secured. Called his partner over, and together they pulled at the edges until the whole panel came loose, revealing a rough opening about 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall. Behind that panel was pure darkness that their flashlights couldn't quite penetrate at first. Officer Ruiz got down on his knees, aimed his light inside, and immediately pulled back, calling for backup on his radio. The crawl space extended beyond what the beam could reach, with fresh scuff marks in the dust and what looked like knee prints leading away from the opening. They told me to pack a bag, that I couldn't stay there tonight. While we waited for more officers, Gregory from next door came out in his bathrobe, asking about all the commotion, said the lights woke him up. Stood there on his porch with this concerned expression, arms crossed against the cold, watching everything unfold. Officer Daniels went to question him while Ruiz stayed with me, but Gregory just shook his head, said he'd been dead asleep until the sirens. When backup arrived with better equipment, they sent Officer Park, a smaller woman who volunteered to go through the crawl space with a helmet cam and heavy-duty flashlight. We watched the feed on a laptop in the police car, and my stomach turned as the tunnel curved left, then right, clearly man-made with support beams every few feet. After about 30 feet of crawling, she reached another opening, this one covered by a piece of thin plywood that pushed out easily. She emerged into what looked like another basement, and I heard her radio crackle as she described seeing a workbench with tools, shelving units, and a water heater in the corner. Then she turned her light toward the wall and found something that made everyone in the car go silent. Photos taped up in neat rows, dozens of them, all taken from inside my apartment. Me cooking dinner, washing dishes, even one of me sleeping on the couch after a long day. The detective who'd just arrived, Detective Morrison, immediately got a warrant for Gregory's house while Officer Park stayed in position. Within 20 minutes, they were at his door with the paperwork. Gregory answered calmly, like he'd been expecting them. Didn't even protest when they told him to step outside. Inside his basement, exactly where Officer Park had emerged, they found the other end of the tunnel system. But it was what they found on his workbench that really got to me. My missing spare key from when I'd first moved in, the one I thought I'd misplaced while unpacking. A notebook with detailed schedules of when I left for work, when I got home, when I typically went to bed. Even had notes about my coffee preference and which drawer I kept the batteries in. The photos went back to my second day living there, hundreds of them organized by date in a filing cabinet. They arrested Gregory right there on his porch, didn't even let him go back inside for shoes. As they put him in the patrol car, he looked straight at me through the window, no expression at all, just staring like I was still something to observe. Detective Morrison told me later that Gregory had dug that tunnel over the course of 3 years, long before I'd moved in. The previous tenant, a college student named Ryan, had complained about missing food and moved out after just 2 months. But nobody had believed him about someone being in his apartment. They found photos of Ryan too, tucked in a separate folder, along with images of the tenant before him. Gregory had apparently been using that tunnel for years, treating whoever lived there like his personal reality show. Frank felt terrible about the whole thing, refunded my entire security deposit plus 2 months of rent, even though it wasn't his fault. He had contractors come seal up that wall with concrete, no more panels, no more access points. But I couldn't stay there. Moved in with a coworker for a few weeks until I found a studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a building downtown, one with cameras in the hallways and a doorman who worked nights. Gregory got 18 months for stalking and breaking and entering, which didn't feel like nearly enough. Sometimes I still wake up at 2 in the morning, listening for drawers opening, for sounds that shouldn't be there. Check my kitchen twice before bed, making sure everything is exactly where I left it. The therapist says it'll fade with time, that hypervigilance after something like this is normal. Maybe she's right, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never live in a basement again. Mason's mother had been gone for 3 months when the noises started in our basement, leaving just the two of us rattling around that split-level house outside Columbus. My son was 9, obsessed with collecting those little metal soldier figures that he'd line up in battle formations across his bedroom floor. We'd grabbed this place in a rush right before school started, one of those 80s builds with yellowish vinyl siding, and a furnace that sounded like it was clearing its throat every time it kicked on. The realtor had knocked $8,000 off the asking price because of the outdated kitchen and the basement that smelled like wet newspaper. But honestly, we just needed somewhere to start over. Mason claimed the upstairs bedroom while I took the master on the main floor, close enough to hear when those nightmares hit him around 2 or 3 in the morning, which happened more often than I'd like to admit. That first Monday in October, I remember specifically because Mason had just brought home straight A's on his report card. I woke up to this metallic scraping sound coming from below, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone filing down a piece of steel. The sound stopped and started in intervals, maybe 10 seconds of scraping, then silence, then scraping again. Mixed in with it, I could hear voices, 2 people having what sounded like a completely normal conversation, though the words were too muffled to make out through the floorboards. My first instinct was to check on Mason since he'd been sleepwalking lately, once even making it all the way to the kitchen where I found him trying to pour cereal at 3 in the morning. But when I cracked his door open, there he was, one arm dangling off the bed, mouth slightly open. Those dinosaur sheets twisted around his legs. The talking downstairs continued, casual and unhurried, like 2 guys discussing a project. I pulled the heavy mag light from my nightstand, the metal cold in my palm, and headed for the basement door off the kitchen. The second I turned the doorknob, everything went dead quiet, that kind of silence that feels intentional, like someone holding their breath. I waited there in my boxers and t-shirt, ear pressed against the door, counting to 30 in my head before flipping the light switch. Click. Nothing. The bulb was dead or missing, leaving just a black hole where the stairs descended. I aimed the mag light down those wooden steps, the beam cutting through dust particles that danced in the air like tiny insects. Each stair groaned under my weight, that old wood sound that makes you wonder if the whole thing might give way. The basement stretched out in front of me, mostly empty except for our moving boxes stacked against one wall, and that workbench the previous owners had left behind, its surface covered in rusty brackets and old paint cans. I swept the light across every corner, checking behind the water heater, around the furnace, even inside the utility closet where the electrical panel lived. Nobody. The concrete floor showed no footprints except my own dusty ones from when we'd moved boxes down there. But there was this smell I hadn't noticed before, kind of industrial, like machine oil mixed with something else, maybe rubber or heated plastic. The side door that led out to the backyard was still padlocked from the inside, the tiny window next to it so covered in grime you couldn't see through it even in daylight. For the next few nights I stayed up late, sitting in the living room with the TV on mute, just listening. The house had its regular sounds, the refrigerator humming, the heating ducts ticking as they cooled, but nothing from the basement. Started thinking maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing, or maybe it was mice in the walls, though mice don't usually have conversations. By Friday, I'd almost convinced myself to forget about it, Even joked with my coworker Phil about needing more coffee to stop hallucinating. Then the following Wednesday rolled around and everything changed. I'd taken a half-day off work to deal with some paperwork at Mason's school. Something about updating emergency contact information now that his mother was out of the picture. Got back to the house around 1:30 in the afternoon, pulling into the driveway behind a white van I didn't recognize. No company logos, no writing on the sides, just a plain white panel van with tinted rear windows and a license plate so mud-covered I couldn't read it. Before I could even process why there was a van in my driveway, the side door of my basement burst open, and two men came walking out like they owned the place. Both wore those neon yellow reflective vests, the kind construction workers use, hard hats tucked under their arms carrying what looked like metal detectors or some kind of scanning equipment. The taller one, maybe 6'3" with a thick mustache that reminded me of a push broom, saw me getting out of my car and actually waved, casual as could be. The shorter guy, stocky with arms like ham hocks and a neck tattoo peeking out from his collar, was already heading toward the van's rear doors. They moved with this practiced efficiency. No hesitation, no surprise at seeing me, like running into the homeowner was just part of their regular routine. The tall one called out something about checking the lines, gestured vaguely toward the street where I could see orange cones set up that definitely hadn't been there when I left. I stood there for maybe 3 seconds, keys still in my hand, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. These guys had just walked out of my locked basement, the one with the padlock I'd checked myself that morning. The tall one was already at the van, sliding his equipment into the back while his partner climbed into the driver's seat. When I finally found my voice and asked what the hell they were doing in my house, the tall one just pointed at his vest like that explained everything. Mumbled something about Columbia Gas checking for leaks. Routine maintenance. Should have gotten a notice. His partner had already started the engine, revving it impatiently, and before I could ask another question, the tall guy hopped in and they peeled out, leaving tire marks on my driveway. The whole encounter lasted maybe 45 seconds, but something about how smooth it was, how rehearsed, made every alarm bell in my head go off at once. I ran to the basement door, still standing wide open, the padlock dangling from the hasp, somehow unlocked. The mechanism wasn't broken or cut, just opened clean, like they had a key or picked it with professional tools. Down in the basement, that industrial smell hit me stronger than before, and I noticed things I'd missed in the dark with just my flashlight. Fresh scratches on the concrete floor near the wall, like something heavy had been dragged. A section of drywall in the corner looked newer than the rest, the paint slightly brighter white, the texture different. One of our moving boxes had been shifted, and when I checked inside, someone had gone through our old photo albums, a few pictures scattered on the floor beneath the box. The pictures were all of Mason as a baby, birthday parties, first day of kindergarten, him with his mother before she left. My chest got tight seeing those photos touched by strangers' hands, and I grabbed my phone to call the police, but then stopped, realizing how insane this would sound without proof. Instead, I called Columbia Gas first, going through 3 different customer service representatives, before reaching someone who could actually check service records. The woman on the phone, Sharon, sounded increasingly concerned as she searched their system, finally telling me in this careful voice that no Columbia Gas crews had been dispatched to my address in over 2 years, and certainly not today. She asked if I wanted to file a report about impersonation, said it was a serious crime, that people sometimes posed as utility workers to case houses for burglaries. While she was talking, I walked around the basement perimeter, running my hand along the walls, and that's when I felt it. A draft coming from behind that newer section of drywall. Not strong, but definitely there. Cold air flowing from somewhere it shouldn't be. Sharon was still talking about security protocols when I grabbed a screwdriver from the workbench and started prying at the edge of that fresh drywall section. The drywall came away easier than it should have, just held in place with a few finishing nails, revealing a hole about 3 feet wide cut straight through the concrete foundation. Professional work, smooth edges, probably done with a concrete saw, the kind contractors use for major renovations. Beyond the hole was a corrugated metal pipe, one of those big storm drain tubes that run under neighborhoods to handle rainwater runoff. The pipe had to be at least 4 feet in diameter, big enough for a grown man to walk through if he hunched over a bit. I could see footprints in the sediment at the bottom, lots of them, going both directions, and that industrial smell was overwhelming now, mixing with the musty stench of stagnant water and decay. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the end of the tunnel in either direction, just disappeared into blackness that seemed to go on forever. Called 911 right then, told them about the break-in, the fake utility workers, and this tunnel I just discovered leading straight into the storm drain system. The cops showed up within 10 minutes, 2 patrol cars and then a detective in an unmarked sedan who introduced himself as Detective Hoffman. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, wearing a wrinkled suit that looked like he'd slept in it, but his eyes were sharp, taking in every detail as I walked him through what happened. When he saw the tunnel opening, he immediately called for backup and a crime scene unit, then got on his radio requesting someone from the city's public works department. While we waited, he asked me detailed questions about the 2 men, had me describe everything I could remember, their height, weight, distinguishing features, the van, even the way they walked. The crime scene techs arrived and started photographing everything, dusting for prints on the drywall edges and the padlock, taking samples of the sediment from inside the tunnel entrance. One of them, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, told Hoffman she could see tool marks on the concrete, definitely a professional job, probably took days to cut through. The guy from Public Works showed up about an hour later, an older man named Eddie who'd been working the city sewers for 23 years, knew every pipe and drain in Columbus like the back of his hand. He took one look at the tunnel entrance and his face went pale, started muttering about how this section of storm drain had been sealed off in 2016 after a homeless camp got flooded out during heavy rains. Said the city had welded shut all the access points, installed security grates, the whole 9 yards, specifically to keep people from getting in there. But here was proof someone had not only gotten in but had been using it as their own private highway under the neighborhood. Eddie pulled up schematics on his tablet, showing Hoffman where the drain ran, and my stomach dropped when I saw it connected to at least 12 other houses on our street, with multiple entry points that led to maintenance hatches scattered throughout the area. Any of those houses could have the same kind of hidden entrance, and the people living there would never know. Hoffman made the decision to send officers into the tunnel while we evacuated to a hotel. Said it wasn't safe for Mason and me to stay there until they figured out what they were dealing with. I packed bags for both of us while trying not to alarm Mason. Told him we were having an adventure, like camping but in a hotel with a pool. Poor kid was excited about the pool, had no idea why his dad's hands were shaking while folding his dinosaur pajamas. Before we left, I watched them send in 2 officers wearing hazmat suits and headlamps, tethered to safety lines in case the tunnel had any surprises. They came back out 20 minutes later with evidence bags full of stuff they'd found down there. Copper piping that had been stripped from somewhere, what looked like mail from different addresses, even a laptop in a waterproof case. One of the officers, his face sheet white despite the exertion, told Hoffman they'd found makeshift camps set up at various points, sleeping bags, camp stoves, stockpiles of food, and something else that made him stop talking when he noticed I was listening. Hoffman walked me to my car, said they'd post an officer at the hotel, gave me his card with his personal cell number written on the back, told me to call if I remembered anything else or if anyone tried to contact me. That night at the hotel, Mason splashed in the pool while I sat on a plastic chair watching him, my phone buzzing every few minutes with updates from Hoffman. They'd arrested 6 people by midnight, all found at different points in the tunnel system, including the 2 guys I'd described from my driveway. The tall one with the mustache turned out to be a former city employee who'd been fired from the water department 5 years ago for stealing equipment. His partner was his cousin, both of them with rap sheets full of burglary and theft charges going back a decade. The other 4 were people nobody expected, a woman who worked at a nearby grocery store, 2 brothers who ran a scrap metal business, and most disturbing, a man who'd been reported missing by his family 3 years ago. They'd been living down there, had turned that abandoned storm drain into their own underground network, complete with stolen electricity tapped from junction boxes and water siphoned from supply lines. The metallic scraping I'd heard that first night was them cutting through pipes in neighboring basements, harvesting copper to sell, and the talking was them planning which house to hit next. What really got me was when Hoffman called the next morning to tell me what else they'd discovered. Those photos of Mason they'd been looking through weren't random curiosity. They'd found notebooks in one of the camps with detailed information about every family on our street, schedules, when people left for work, when kids got home from school, who had dogs, who had security systems. My house was marked as single father, 1 child, no dog, basic locks, basement access confirmed. They'd been watching us for weeks before they even cut through our foundation, knew exactly when they could work without being heard, knew I wouldn't be home that Wednesday afternoon because they'd seen me leave at the same time the previous week for Mason's school appointment. The whole operation was sophisticated in a way that made my skin prickle. These weren't just random criminals, but people who'd turned violating others' homes into a science. The city ended up evacuating the entire street for a week, while they sealed every access point with reinforced concrete, installed monitoring equipment, and swept the whole system for anyone else who might be down there. They found 2 more people on the 3rd day, living so deep in the system they hadn't even known about the arrests, surviving on canned goods and rainwater like some kind of post-apocalyptic scenario playing out beneath our suburban street. We never went back to that house. I broke the lease, took the financial hit, didn't care about losing the security deposit or the penalties. Found us the apartment on the 7th floor of a building downtown, one with a doorman, security cameras in every hallway, and most importantly, no basement. Mason adjusted better than I expected, though he still asks sometimes why we had to move so suddenly, why we couldn't go back for the rest of his toys. I tell him the house had problems. Leave it at that. Figure when he's older I'll explain the whole thing if he really wants to know. The nightmares he'd been having after his mother left actually stopped after we moved. Like somehow his subconscious knew we were safer in that concrete tower than we'd ever been in that house with its hidden vulnerabilities. All 8 people they arrested got prison time, sentences ranging from 18 months to 7 years for the ringleaders, though that feels like nothing compared to the violation they put our whole neighborhood through. 6 months later, I ran into one of our old neighbors at a Kroger across town, a woman named Beth who'd lived 3 houses down from us. She told me they'd sold too, couldn't sleep knowing what had been happening literally beneath their feet all that time. Said the whole street had basically emptied out within a year, property values tanked, and the city was still dealing with lawsuits from families who'd discovered evidence of intrusion in their homes during the investigation. Pictures missing, items moved, food taken from refrigerators, little violations that suddenly made sense in the context of what had been discovered. She mentioned they'd found DNA evidence in 7 different houses, proving the tunnel people had been coming up into homes for months, maybe years, whenever they knew families were away. The strangest part was learning later from the prosecution files that the man who'd been missing for 3 years, the one living in the tunnels, had actually chosen to be there, had left his family to join this underground community because he believed society above ground was collapsing. Even now, writing this at my desk in our new place with the city lights twinkling outside, I still check the locks 3 times before bed, still wake up at the slightest unusual sound, still feel that primitive fear when I hear something that reminds me of metal scraping against concrete. The notification from RoomShare popped up on my phone during a particularly rough month in 2022, right when Jenna and I were staring at our credit card statements spread across the kitchen table. We'd bought the house in Denver the previous year, convinced we could handle the mortgage on our combined salaries. But between the car breaking down and her dad's medical bills, things had gotten tight. The basement had its own entrance around the side of the house, a full bathroom, and enough space for someone to live comfortably, So when Jenna suggested renting it out, I figured why not. The app made everything seem so easy and safe, with background checks and verified profiles. And within 3 days, we had our first serious inquiry from someone named Thomas Brennan, who said he worked nights at a warehouse and just needed a quiet place to sleep during the day. Thomas showed up on a Saturday morning to view the space, and I remember thinking how unremarkable he looked. Just an average guy in his 40s with thinning brown hair and clothes that seemed deliberately chosen to blend in, khakis and a plain blue polo shirt. He barely spoke above a whisper when he talked, had this way of nodding along to everything we said, and paid 3 months up front in cash, which should have been my first red flag, but honestly just felt like a relief at the time. He moved in with just 2 suitcases and a laptop bag, said he traveled light because of his job, and for the first couple weeks everything seemed perfect. He was so quiet we sometimes forgot he was even down there, never asked for anything, never complained about the old water heater that made that weird knocking sound, and always left his rent money in an envelope taped to our back door on the 1st of each month, even though I told him he could just transfer it through the app. About a month in, Jenna started mentioning these little things that didn't quite add up, like how she'd never heard him use the microwave or the TV we'd left down there, never smelled food cooking, never heard water running except for the toilet flushing occasionally. She worked from home doing medical transcription and said the basement was dead silent all day, even though Thomas supposedly slept during those hours after his night shifts. We'd see him leaving around 9 at night through the side entrance, always carrying the same black backpack, always wearing dark clothes, and he'd return around 6 in the morning, though sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement through the basement window at odd hours when he should have been at work. The strangest part was the darkness. We never saw lights on down there, not even the glow from a phone screen or laptop, just complete blackness behind those small rectangular windows at ground level. One evening I went down to check the water meter, which was in a utility closet in the basement hallway, and noticed Thomas had installed a deadbolt on his door from the inside, one of those heavy-duty ones you'd see on a front door. When I knocked to ask about it, just making conversation really, he opened the door maybe 3 inches, his face partially hidden in the shadows, and explained in that soft voice that he had expensive equipment for his work and felt better with extra security. The smell that came from his room was odd, not bad exactly, but sharp and chemical, like fresh plastic mixed with something metallic, and I could hear this faint humming sound, maybe a fan or some kind of machine running. He must have seen me trying to peer past him because he shifted his body to block my view completely, then thanked me for understanding about the lock and gently closed the door before I could respond. Jenna had this habit of doing yoga in our bedroom every morning, and one day in early December she came downstairs looking puzzled, saying she kept hearing these tiny clicking sounds while she was in downward dog, like someone tapping a pencil against wood but coming from below. Our bedroom was directly above Thomas's living area, and when we both went upstairs to listen, sure enough, there were these intermittent clicking noises, so faint you had to really concentrate to hear them. I figured maybe he had some kind of hobby, model building or something. People who work nights often have unusual ways to unwind, but Jenna started changing in the bathroom after that. Said she just felt weird about it, even though there was no logical reason. We also noticed our cat, Mango, absolutely refused to go near the basement door anymore, would hiss and arch his back if we even carried him close to it, which was bizarre because he used to love sleeping on the warm spot where the heating vent came up through the floor there. The night everything went to hell started with me jerking awake at 2 in the morning to the sound of water rushing through the walls, that unmistakable whoosh that means a pipe has given way somewhere. I grabbed a flashlight and ran to the basement door, pounding on it and shouting for Thomas, but got no response, even though his car was in the driveway. The water was already seeping under the door into our hallway, and I could hear it spraying full force somewhere below. I threw my shoulder against the door hard. Once, twice, and on the third hit the frame splintered, and the deadbolt ripped free from the wood. The basement was pitch black, and my flashlight beam caught the water first, cascading from a burst pipe in the ceiling, soaking everything. But as I swung the light around looking for the shutoff valve, I saw something that made my brain just stop processing for a second. The ceiling was covered in holes, dozens of them, each about the width of a quarter, drilled in precise patterns across the drywall. Some had thin cables snaking through them, others were plugged with what looked like small glass lenses, and all of them were positioned directly under the rooms where Jenna and I spent our time. My flashlight caught more details as I stood there in shock. A desk covered in monitors showing grainy green-tinted footage, boxes of electronic equipment I couldn't identify, and notebooks filled with handwritten schedules and observations. The monitors were still running on battery backup, and I could see our living room from above, our kitchen, and worst of all, our bedroom, all filmed from those tiny holes he'd so carefully hidden in the textured ceiling upstairs. One screen showed Jenna asleep in our bed at that very moment, and another had folders labeled with dates going back to the day Thomas moved in. I heard footsteps on the stairs behind me, and Thomas was suddenly there, not in work clothes but in dark athletic gear, his face completely different without the meek expression he usually wore, now sharp and focused and calculating. He didn't say anything, just looked at me, then at his equipment, then back at me, like he was doing math in his head about what would happen next. I started backing toward the door, keeping the flashlight aimed at his face, and told him the police were already on their way, which was a lie but seemed like the right thing to say. He smiled then, not the nervous smile I'd seen before but something confident and practiced, and said in a voice much deeper than his usual whisper that I had no idea how many places he'd been or how many people had thought they were safe in their own homes. Then he moved faster than I expected, not toward me but to his desk, grabbing something before sprinting past me and up the stairs, shoving me hard into the wall as he went. By the time I got upstairs, Jenna was standing in the hallway with her phone, saying she'd heard the crash and already called 911, but Thomas was gone, the front door wide open and cold December air rushing in. His car was still in the driveway, which meant he'd fled on foot, probably had another vehicle stashed nearby or someone waiting to pick him up. The whole thing planned out like everything else he'd done. The police arrived within minutes, and I took them down to the basement, which was now ankle-deep in water from the still gushing pipe. But the equipment was still there, those monitors still glowing with their sick green light, showing every private moment we thought we'd had. The detective who specialized in these cases told us to pack some things and find somewhere else to stay for a few days while they processed the scene. Said Thomas had likely been recording everything for months, possibly selling the footage or just keeping it for his own twisted reasons. The investigation revealed things that still make me nauseous when I think about them, like how Thomas Brennan wasn't even his real name, just one of at least 6 identities they could trace. The detective showed us photos from other rental properties in Colorado and Wyoming, where similar setups had been found. Always basement apartments, always couples or single women living above, always the same pattern of holes drilled with surgical precision. They found receipt copies in his desk for specialty surveillance equipment, ordered to different addresses, some dating back 3 years, and a laptop with encrypted files the FBI tech team was still trying to crack. The worst part was learning from the neighbors that they'd seen someone matching his description at odd hours, sometimes just standing in our backyard at night, looking up at our windows, and they'd assumed it was just the tenant getting some air, nothing worth mentioning. We stayed in a hotel for a week while contractors repaired the water damage and patched all those holes, though knowing where each one had been still makes my skin itch when I walk through the house. Jenna couldn't sleep for months, would wake up checking the ceiling with her phone's flashlight, convinced she could hear that clicking sound again, even though Thomas was long gone. We had a security system installed, cameras covering every angle of the property, motion sensors, the whole deal, which felt ironic given what had happened, trading one form of surveillance for another. The detective called a few times with updates, said they'd connected Thomas to at least 12 similar cases across 4 states, but he'd vanished completely, probably using another identity they hadn't uncovered yet, maybe already setting up in another basement somewhere, drilling his neat little holes while some unsuspecting couple slept above him. 6 months later, I was grabbing coffee downtown when I swear I saw him across the street. Same height, same thinning hair, wearing those generic clothes meant to blend into any crowd. My whole body went rigid, and I stood there watching as he walked into a hardware store, probably buying more drill bits, more tiny cameras, more cables to snake through someone else's ceiling. I called the detective immediately, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone, and the store's security footage showed someone who looked similar but not quite the same, though the detective admitted these guys were experts at changing their appearance just enough to create doubt. We ended up selling the house 2 months after that. Took a loss on it, but didn't care. Just needed to be somewhere he'd never been. Somewhere without a basement. Somewhere we could shower and sleep and live without wondering what might be watching from inside the walls. The new buyers were a young family with kids, and I wanted to warn them, to tell them everything. But my lawyer said we'd disclosed what we legally had to, and anything more might be seen as trying to sabotage the sale. So I just handed over the keys and hoped they'd never need to find out why we'd installed so many locks. The conference in Seattle wasn't something I could skip, not with the promotion hanging in the balance and my boss watching every move I made. Hotels downtown were charging $300 a night minimum, which would have blown through my travel allowance in 2 days. So I scrolled through Airbnb until I found something reasonable. $60 a night for a whole house seemed too good to pass up, even if it meant a 40-minute drive to the convention center each morning. The listing showed a charming craftsman-style place with original hardwood floors and vintage fixtures, the kind of house my grandmother would have loved. The host, Martin, had stellar reviews, mostly from business travelers like me who praised his quick responses in the peaceful neighborhood. I booked 5 nights without hesitation, figuring I'd just need a clean bed and a hot shower after 12-hour days at the conference. Martin met me at the house on Sunday evening, right as the October rain started picking up. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with perfectly combed hair and clothes that looked like he'd ironed them twice. His handshake lasted a beat too long, and he maintained this intense eye contact while explaining the house rules, like he was trying to memorize my face. The place was exactly as advertised, maybe even nicer, with fresh flowers on the dining table and a welcome basket full of local coffee and snacks. He walked me through each room, pointing out the thermostat, the Wi-Fi password taped to the router, the extra towels in the linen closet. When we reached the hallway, he stopped at a white door near the kitchen and his whole demeanor shifted. His voice dropped lower, more serious, as he explained that this was the basement door, and it needed to stay locked at all times. Something about ongoing renovations, exposed wiring, insurance liability, the usual concerns that property owners have. He actually pulled on the handle to show me it was secured, then watched me nod in understanding before his smile returned. The first 2 nights passed without incident. I'd leave early for the conference, grabbing coffee from the kitchen while the house sat silent in the pre-dawn darkness, and return after 10 each night, too exhausted to do anything but shower and collapse into bed. The house had this settled quietness that old places develop, with the occasional creak of wood, adjusting to temperature changes, or pipes ticking behind the walls. On Monday night, I'd actually stood in the hallway eating takeout Chinese food, staring at that basement door while wondering what kind of renovation required such strict warnings. The door looked ancient, with layers of white paint that had yellowed at the edges, and an old-fashioned keyhole beneath the modern deadbolt Martin had installed. I even bent down once to peek through the keyhole, seeing nothing but black, before feeling ridiculous and heading to bed. Wednesday changed everything. The conference ended early due to a speaker cancellation, so I got back to the house around 6 instead of my usual 10:30. I decided to take advantage of the extra time, pouring myself wine from a bottle I'd bought and settling onto the couch with my laptop to review presentations. The house felt different in the evening light, more lived in somehow, like someone had just stepped out for groceries. Around 8, while I was deep in a spreadsheet, I heard this rhythmic creaking from somewhere below. My first thought was the washing machine, maybe on an automatic cycle, but Martin hadn't mentioned any appliances in the basement. The sound continued for maybe 10 minutes, steady and deliberate, like footsteps pacing back and forth on old wooden stairs. I actually muted my laptop and pressed my ear to the floor, trying to locate the source. But the moment I did, the sound stopped completely, as if someone down there had heard me listening. I texted Martin about the noise, trying to keep it casual, asking if there was any automated equipment in the basement that might be running. He replied within seconds, which struck me as odd for 8 at night, saying it was probably just the old boiler system settling for the evening and apologizing if it disturbed my work. His response should have been reassuring, but the speed of it, like he'd been waiting for my message, made me uneasy. I went back to my spreadsheets, but concentration was impossible. Every small sound made me look up, and I found myself glancing repeatedly at that hallway where the basement door waited. Around 9, I heard what sounded like metal scraping against wood, just once. Brief but distinct. I grabbed my phone to text Martin again, but stopped, realizing how paranoid I'd sound complaining about every little noise in an old house. That night, I couldn't fall asleep. I lay in the darkness of the guest bedroom, listening to the house breathe around me, trying to separate normal settling sounds from anything else. Sometime after midnight, maybe closer to 1, I heard the definitive sound of footsteps beneath the floorboards. Not the random creaking of old wood, but a clear pattern. 7 steps one way, a pause, 7 steps back. The counting became automatic, something my brain did without permission, and with each repetition, the pause grew longer. During one of these pauses, I heard something that made me sit straight up in bed. The distinct sound of a doorknob turning. That specific metallic click and release. I knew immediately which door it was, even from the bedroom. My phone was in my hand before I'd made the conscious decision to grab it, thumb hovering over the emergency call button while I strained to hear what would come next. The footsteps that followed were different, heavier and more deliberate, moving through the hallway toward the living room. I could track them by the way different floorboards complained under the weight. Each creak mapping out a path through the house I'd walked myself just hours earlier. They stopped near the couch where I'd been working, and I heard the unmistakable sound of papers rustling. My work documents were still spread across the coffee table, including contracts with my company's letterhead, my business cards, even my travel itinerary with my home address printed at the top. The silence that followed felt deliberate, like someone reading, absorbing information. Then came a sound that nearly made me call out, the wine glass I'd left on the table being picked up and set down again, the faint ring of glass meeting wood echoing in the darkness. I did the stupidest thing possible. I got out of bed and crept to the bedroom door, pressing my face against the wood to listen better. The living room was maybe 20 feet away, a straight shot down the hallway, and whoever was out there would only need to turn the corner to see my door. But I had to know if this was real or if I was having some kind of exhaustion-induced breakdown. My hand found the doorknob, turned it with excruciating slowness to avoid any sound, and I opened the door just enough to peer out with one eye. The hallway was dark, but streetlight from the living room windows created this dim gray twilight, enough to see shapes and shadows. And there, standing beside the coffee table with my papers in his hands, was Martin. He was wearing different clothes than when he'd met me on Sunday, a worn undershirt and sweatpants like he'd been sleeping. But what made me pull back and nearly gasp aloud was realizing he was barefoot, and his feet were dirty, covered in what looked like dust or soil, leaving faint prints on the hardwood floor. I closed the door with infinite care, turned the lock so slowly that it took nearly 30 seconds for the bolt to fully engage, then backed away until my legs hit the bed. My mind was racing through possibilities, each more insane than the last. Maybe he'd forgotten something important and had a spare key. Maybe there was an emergency. Maybe he was checking on the property. But none of that explained why he'd come through the basement or why he was going through my personal papers at 1 in the morning. I could hear him moving again, those dirty feet padding across the floor toward the kitchen. The refrigerator opened, stayed open for maybe a minute, then closed. Water ran in the sink. Normal sounds that became terrifying because they shouldn't be happening. I started recording video on my phone, not of him, but of the door crack where light might show movement, evidence that I wasn't imagining this. The next sound was worse than anything before. The squeak of weight settling onto the couch springs, like he was making himself comfortable in the living room. I could picture him out there, maybe still holding my papers, sitting in the dark just 30 feet from where I was hiding. My phone showed 1:47 a.m., and I made the decision to wait him out, to stay locked in this room until daylight, then get out and never come back. But around 2:30, after nearly an hour of silence, I heard him stand and walk back toward the hallway. The footsteps paused right outside my door, and I swear I could hear breathing. This slow, measured rhythm, like someone trying to detect signs of consciousness from within. My own breath stopped entirely, my whole body rigid under the covers where I dove the moment he'd started moving. The doorknob rattled once, just a gentle test, finding it locked. Then nothing for maybe 5 minutes. Absolute stillness before those footsteps retreated back toward the kitchen, and that basement door opened and closed with its familiar creak. I didn't sleep, not for 1 second. I sat on that bed with my back against the headboard, phone clutched in both hands, watching the door and listening to every sound the house made for the rest of the night. When gray dawn light finally crept through the curtains, I threw everything into my suitcase without folding anything, not caring about wrinkles or organization. I waited until 6:30, when the neighborhood would have people heading to work, witnesses around if something went wrong, then unlocked my door and walked straight to my car without looking anywhere but forward. Before driving away, though, I had to know. I walked around the back of the house, my keys gripped between my fingers like claws, until I found it. A storm door cellar entrance, the kind with angled metal doors that lead from outside directly into the basement. The padlock that should have secured it was hanging open, and there were fresh scrape marks in the dirt, where the doors had been repeatedly opened. The grass around it was worn down to bare earth in a rough path that led to a cluster of trees where the property line ended. When the police searched the basement 3 hours later, after I'd called them from a Starbucks parking lot 10 miles away, they found a makeshift living space behind the boiler. A sleeping bag, camp stove, boxes of canned food, and a milk crate full of items taken from previous guests. A watch, several driver's licenses, pieces of jewelry, phone chargers, even underwear. Martin had been living down there for months, they said, entering through that outside entrance and moving through the house at night while guests slept above him. The detective who called me later said they'd found notebooks where he'd written detailed observations about each guest, what time they went to bed, their daily routines, phone conversations he'd overheard through the floorboards. My name was already there, along with notes about my conference schedule and a sketch of my face that was disturbingly accurate. They arrested him at his actual apartment across town, where he'd been maintaining the appearance of a normal life while essentially living beneath his rental property, surfacing at night like some kind of human rodent to study the people who'd paid him to feel safe. There are nights when silence feels heavier than usual, like the whole house is waiting for something to happen. I remember one of those nights vividly, mostly because it started out so ordinary. I had just come home after another long evening shift at the diner where I worked. My routine was always the same: drop my keys on the counter, kick off my shoes, and heat up whatever leftovers were still in the fridge. That night, though, when I walked through the kitchen, I noticed a faint glow coming from the hallway that led to the basement door. The light was on down there, which didn't make sense. I never used the basement except to store tools and boxes that hadn't been touched in years. At first, I laughed it off, thinking I must have flipped the switch by accident one morning when I was half awake. Still, something about that dim yellow light spilling under the door made me uneasy. The basement always had this strange, still air about it, like time stopped at the bottom of those steps. I opened the door and stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself I was just being ridiculous. The bulb buzzed faintly, casting long shadows over the concrete floor. I almost turned it off right then, but curiosity got the better of me. When I went down, I noticed how thick the dust layer had gotten since the last time I'd been there. You could see every small print from mice, the outline of old pipes, and my own footprints from months ago. Near the far wall, close to the furnace, I spotted something new. A few half-formed boot prints, much larger than my own. The shape was distinct, almost recent, like someone had walked there not long ago and disturbed the dust just enough to leave a clear mark. I told myself maybe the plumber had left them when he came by earlier that year, but deep down, I knew he never walked that far in. That image of those footprints stuck with me the rest of the night. I went back upstairs, double-checked every lock, and tried to sleep with the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. But around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a faint metallic sound echoing through the vents, like something lightly brushing against the inside of the ducts. Came again, slower this time, followed by a hollow tap that seemed to move across the house. I stared at the ceiling, counting each sound, pretending it was just the heating system settling. But the truth was, I had never heard those noises before. The next morning, I checked the basement again, hoping to find something that would make sense of the noise. Everything looked the same cold air, same quiet hum from the furnace. Still, I could not stop staring at those footprints. I knelt down, touched the dust, and realized the top layer seemed freshly disturbed again, like someone had stepped there after I had gone upstairs. I told myself it must have been airflow from the vents, or maybe a small animal. But that explanation did not sit right. The house was sealed up tight, and I had not seen a single mouse in years. 2 nights later, the metallic sounds returned, sharper this time. They moved from one vent to another, like something crawling through the ductwork. Then came a faint whiff of cigarette smoke. It was so subtle that I almost ignored it, but the smell lingered long enough for me to notice where it came from, the vent near my bed. I sat there for what felt like an hour, just listening. The furnace was off. The house was still. But that smell, cheap, acrid tobacco, seeped out from below, mixing with the stale air of my room. I could not remember the last time anyone had smoked inside this house. I barely slept that night, and when dawn came, I decided to check the basement again. The air down there was heavier, colder, and the smell of smoke was stronger. I noticed a few ashes on the concrete near the furnace, tiny gray flakes scattered close to the vent opening. That was when I noticed something odd behind the furnace. There was a narrow panel of metal, slightly misaligned. When I crouched and looked closer, I realized it was not part of the furnace at all, but a piece of sheet metal wedged over a small opening in the wall. Behind it, a dark void stretched deeper than I could see. I hesitated before pulling it aside. The sound of my own breathing filled the room. When I finally shifted the metal enough to look inside, a faint draft hit my face, cool and stale. The crawl space was cramped and uneven, with old insulation hanging like cobwebs. I shined my phone's flashlight in and saw a few things that made my chest tighten. A crumpled blanket, an empty can of beans, and a half-burned cigarette resting on a brick. Someone had been staying down there, watching, listening. I backed away slowly, not sure what to do next. I stood there, gripping the edge of the furnace, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. It was not just that someone had been living down there, it was that they had been close enough to hear everything I did. Every step, every door opening, every phone call. I thought about the faint sounds I'd brushed off for weeks. It all fit together now in the worst possible way. The vent outside must have been their entrance, hidden behind the shrubs near the side of the house. I never noticed it before because I hardly went back there. I backed away and called the police, my voice trembling as I tried to explain. The dispatcher told me to wait outside until officers arrived. Standing in the driveway, I could see the faint glow of my basement light through the small window near the ground. It was strange, knowing that someone might still be in there, maybe watching me from the shadows. When the officers finally arrived, they went inside with flashlights and weapons drawn. I heard one of them yell something, followed by the sound of boots pounding against the floor. They pulled out a man who looked like he had not slept in days. His clothes were filthy, and his eyes darted around like a cornered animal's. The officers said he had been sneaking in at night through the vent, hiding in that crawl space whenever I was home. There were food wrappers, cigarette butts, and even a small radio tuned to static. He had made himself comfortable in my walls, using the ducts to listen to me move from room to room. The realization made my chest feel hollow. I had been living above him, completely unaware, for who knows how long. After they took him away, I had every vent sealed and the crawl space welded shut. The house felt different after that. Quieter, but not in a peaceful way. Sometimes late at night, I still catch myself glancing toward the basement door, half expecting to see that faint yellow light seeping out again. It has been months since it happened, but I cannot shake the feeling that the silence in this house is not empty anymore. It feels like it is waiting, listening, just like he once did. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The van died right as I was passing the old Packard plant ruins, that stretch of Concord Street, where even the cops don't bother patrolling anymore. I'd been making deliveries for Fresh Direct since my 31st birthday 3 months earlier. Needed something steady after the divorce papers got finalized. Detroit in August feels like breathing through a wet towel most nights, but when every streetlight went dead at exactly 9:47, the humidity somehow got worse. The whole city just stopped. No warning, no flicker, just instant black. I actually laughed at first, sitting there in my busted van, thinking it was just my luck to have the alternator crap out the same moment a transformer blew somewhere. But then I stuck my head out the window and saw it wasn't just my block. Every building, every traffic light, every neon sign, dead. The only light came from a few cars still running, their headlights cutting through the dark like searchlights in a prison yard. I tried calling dispatch, but my phone had no signal, not even emergency service. The radio in the van was dead static on every channel. After 20 minutes of trying to get the engine to turn over, I finally gave up and grabbed my backpack from behind the seat. Home was maybe 4 miles northwest, straight through Brush Park and past the old Tiger Stadium site. On a normal night, it would have been an annoying but doable walk. But standing there on that empty street with the Packard plant looming like some massive corpse behind me, I felt this weird pressure in my chest. The darkness wasn't just dark. It was thick, almost solid. Without the constant background hum of the city, every sound seemed amplified. My footsteps echoed off the abandoned buildings, each one bouncing back at me from different angles. That's when I heard it for the first time. An engine idling somewhere behind me, maybe 2 blocks back. No headlights, just the low rumble of a V8. Patient and steady. I picked up my pace heading west on Hendry Street, telling myself it was just another driver lost in the blackout. But the engine followed, maintaining that same distance, never getting closer, but never falling behind. When I turned north onto Russell, the sound disappeared completely. For maybe 30 seconds, I thought I'd been paranoid over nothing. Then I saw it, a dark shape rolling through the intersection I'd just crossed, engine off, coasting silent. The car was using momentum to follow me without making noise. My mouth went dry as sand. Nobody does that unless they don't want you to know they're there. I started jogging, not quite running, but moving fast enough that my delivery uniform stuck to my back with sweat. The engine started up again, louder now, more aggressive. When I cut through an alley between 2 warehouses, the car actually accelerated, tires squealing as it took the corner hard to circle around the block. I came out the other end of the alley onto Saint Antoine and immediately ducked behind a dumpster. The smell hit me like a physical wall, rotting food mixed with something chemical. but I pressed myself against the brick wall and waited. The car rolled past slow, windows down, and for the first time I got a decent look at it in the dim moonlight. It was an old Crown Victoria, the kind cops used to drive before they switched to SUVs, painted that flat primer gray that seems to swallow light. The driver was just a shadow, but I could see him turning his head back and forth, scanning the empty sidewalks. Then he stopped right in front of the alley entrance, engine ticking as it cooled. He knew I was close. I could hear him breathing through the open window, these deep, deliberate breaths like he was trying to smell me out. My legs started cramping from crouching, but I didn't dare move. After what felt like hours but was probably 2 minutes, he revved the engine once, a warning or a promise, and continued down the street. The smart move would have been to stay hidden until dawn, but I needed to get home. My insulin was in the fridge and I'd already missed my evening dose. Without it, things would get bad fast. The shakes, the confusion, then worse. So I waited another 5 minutes before creeping out from behind the dumpster. The streets were tomb quiet except for distant car alarms that had been triggered when the power died. Their batteries slowly dying too, each alarm getting weaker and more distorted. I stuck to the shadows, moving from doorway to doorway like I'd seen in movies, feeling ridiculous but too scared to walk in the open. At Forest Avenue, I found an abandoned convenience store with its security gate half raised. The owner must have been closing when the blackout hit. I slipped inside, hoping to find a working phone or maybe just catch my breath. The store had been picked clean already. Shadows moved in the back, probably looters, but they scattered when they heard me. On the counter, someone had left a half-eaten sandwich and a warm beer. My stomach cramped from hunger, but I couldn't risk stopping to eat. Through the store's front window, I watched the street for any sign of the Crown Vic. Nothing for 10 minutes, then 15. I was about to leave when I noticed something that made my knees weak. Across the street, barely visible in the darkness, was another car. A beat-up Chrysler 300 with tinted windows. It had been there the whole time, just sitting, waiting. As I watched, the driver's door opened and someone stepped out. Even in the dark, I could tell it was a woman, tall and thin, wearing what looked like medical scrubs. She walked to the middle of the street and just stood there, head tilted up like she was listening for something. Then she raised her hand and made a circular motion in the air. Within seconds, I heard engines starting up all around the block. Not just one or two, at least 5 different vehicles, all coming to life at once. They'd been sitting dark this whole time, surrounding the store, waiting for her signal. The woman got back in her car and all the engines started moving, converging on the store from different directions. I bolted through the back exit into a loading dock area that stank of spoiled milk and diesel fuel. Behind the store was a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, but someone had cut a hole near the bottom months ago. I squeezed through, tearing my uniform shirt on the twisted metal, and found myself in the parking lot of an old body shop. Broken windshields crunched under my feet as I ran between the skeletal remains of stripped cars. Behind me, I heard car doors slamming and voices. Calm, organized voices giving directions like they were coordinating a search grid. These weren't random criminals taking advantage of the blackout. This was something else, something planned. I made it to Gratiot Avenue and had to make a choice. Take the main road where I could move faster, but be completely exposed, or stick to the side streets and risk getting cornered. That's when I saw it. The people mover track overhead, its rails disappearing into the darkness. The automated trains wouldn't be running without power, but the emergency walkways alongside the tracks would still be there. If I could get up there, no car could follow. The nearest station entrance was 3 blocks north at Cadillac Square. I ran flat out, no longer caring about noise, my work boots slapping against the pavement in a rhythm that seemed to echo forever in the dead city. Behind me, engines roared as the cars spread out, trying to cut off my escape routes. At Broadway, one of them, a black Escalade with a cracked windshield, came screaming around the corner, tires smoking. The driver tried to clip me, but I dove between 2 parked cars just as the SUV's mirror exploded against a parking meter. The impact spun the Escalade sideways, and it slammed into a storefront, glass cascading across the sidewalk like ice. But I could already hear another engine coming from the opposite direction. They were herding me, pushing me toward something. The Cadillac Square station loomed ahead, its entrance a black mouth in the side of the building. The electronic turnstiles were dead, frozen in the open position. I vaulted over them and took the stairs 3 at a time, my chest burning, legs starting to shake from the adrenaline and lack of insulin. The platform was pitch black except for the emergency exit signs running on battery backup, their green glow barely reaching past the yellow safety strip. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight, cursing when I remembered the battery had died. The maintenance walkway was behind a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The lock had been broken years ago, according to every Urban Explorer video I'd ever watched about Detroit. Sure enough, it swung open with a rusty shriek. The walkway was narrow, maybe 3 feet wide, with a rusted railing on one side and nothing but a 20-foot drop to the street on the other. Old cables and pipes ran along the wall, covered in decades of pigeon droppings and diesel exhaust residue. I started moving carefully along the track, testing each step on the metal grating. Below, I could hear the cars circling the station like sharks, engines revving. They knew where I'd gone. Flashlight beams suddenly blazed up from the street, sweeping across the underside of the track. They were getting out of their cars, looking for a way up. About 100 yards down the track, I heard something that stopped me cold. Footsteps on the metal walkway behind me, moving fast and confident like whoever it was knew exactly where they were going in the dark. I tried to speed up, but the grating was slick with oil and bird droppings. My foot slipped and I went down hard on one knee, the impact rattling the whole section of walkway. The footsteps behind me stopped, then started again, faster now. Up ahead, I could make out the next station platform in the dim green glow of its exit signs. But as I got closer, I saw shadows moving on the platform, at least 3 people waiting for me. They'd sent someone ahead to cut me off. The walkway curved around a support pillar, and for a moment I was hidden from both the platform and whoever was behind me. That's when I noticed it. A maintenance ladder bolted to the pillar, leading down to what looked like an old utility tunnel entrance. The rungs were thick with rust and bird mess, but it was either that or get trapped between 2 groups. I swung myself over the railing and started climbing down, trying not to think about the last time these bolts had been inspected. The ladder ended at a concrete ledge barely wide enough to stand on. The utility tunnel entrance was sealed with a steel grate, but the bottom corner had been pried open, probably by copper thieves. I squeezed through into absolute darkness that smelled like stagnant water and dead rats. Using the wall to guide myself, I moved deeper into the tunnel, my breathing loud in the confined space. After about 50 feet, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber, some kind of old switching station from when the People Mover was built. Weak light filtered through ventilation grates in the ceiling, just enough to see the shapes of old electrical panels and rusted equipment. I heard voices echoing down the tunnel behind me, then the scrape of someone forcing themselves through the grate. But there was another sound too, water running somewhere close by. Following the sound, I found a drainage pipe, maybe 4 feet in diameter with a steady stream of water flowing through it. The pipe led toward what I hoped was the river. It would be nasty, probably full of sewage overflow, but it might get me out of this trap. I was about to climb in when my vision started to blur. The lack of insulin was catching up fast. My hands were trembling now, not from fear but from my blood sugar crashing. The drainage pipe was my only option. I dropped into the lukewarm water that came up to my knees, gagging at the smell of sewage and chemicals. Moving bent over in the pipe made my back scream, but I pushed forward, one hand on the slimy wall for balance. Behind me, I heard splashing. They'd found the pipe and were following. The water got deeper as the pipe angled down, rising to my waist, then my chest. Just when I thought I'd have to turn back or drown, I saw light ahead, real light, not the green glow of exit signs. The pipe opened onto a concrete canal that I recognized as the Dequindre Cut, the old rail line converted to a greenway. I pulled myself out, soaked and reeking, my whole body shaking now from the blood sugar crash. I needed to get home, get insulin, or I'd pass out soon. But standing at the edge of the canal, flashlights cutting through the darkness behind them, were two more of them. A heavy-set man in a security guard uniform and a younger guy wearing a FedEx shirt. They'd been waiting here the whole time, knowing exactly where the pipe led. The security guard spoke into a radio. "We got him at the cut. Bring the van." That's when I understood. They weren't trying to catch me. They were wearing me down, exhausting me, waiting for me to collapse on my own. The FedEx guy started walking toward me, hands up like he was trying to calm a spooked animal. "Just relax, man. You're gonna pass out in about 5 minutes anyway. We've been watching you for weeks. We know about your condition, your insulin schedule, everything. Should have taken your evening dose at 8, right? It's almost midnight now." My legs gave out and I dropped to my knees on the concrete. Through my blurred vision, I saw the woman in scrubs walking down the embankment carrying a medical bag. She knelt beside me and I felt the sharp prick of a needle in my arm. Not insulin. Something that made my muscles go slack immediately. As she worked, she spoke in this conversational tone like we were old friends. "You delivered to the wrong house 3 weeks ago. Remember that package for Riverside Drive? The one you left at the blue house instead of the gray one? Our client was very unhappy about that delay. The package contained something time-sensitive, something that degraded because of your mistake." She pulled out another syringe, this one filled with clear liquid. "This is insulin. We're not monsters. But our client wants you to understand that mistakes have consequences, that someone is always watching, always keeping track." I woke up in my apartment 2 days later, according to my phone. My insulin kit was sitting on the kitchen counter with a note. "Next time, double-check the address." The power was back on, the city humming with its usual noise. I called the police, but what was I going to tell them? That a group of people in regular clothes hunted me through the city during a blackout because of a misdelivered package? They found no evidence. The cars, the people, even the woman in scrubs were ghosts. Fresh Direct said I never showed up for my shift that night, that I'd called in sick. The security footage from every camera along my route showed nothing but darkness from the blackout. I quit the job that day, moved in with my sister in Grand Rapids the next week. Sometimes I Google that address on Riverside Drive, trying to figure out what could have been in that package, what could have been worth all that. But mostly I just try not to think about how many other delivery drivers are out there, making innocent mistakes, not knowing that someone is keeping score, not knowing that the next blackout might be for them. The heat in Arlington that July was suffocating, the kind that makes your clothes stick to your skin the second you step outside. I'd just gotten home from my shift at the hospital, 12 hours in the ER dealing with heat stroke cases and dehydration. All I wanted was a cold shower and to collapse in front of the AC with leftover Chinese takeout. My daughter Kayla was spending the week with her dad in Houston, so I had the whole house to myself for once. The divorce papers had my birth year right there in black and white, 1987, and somehow seeing it made everything feel more final. I remember thinking how quiet the neighborhood was that evening, everyone probably hiding inside from the heat. Our street, Willow Creek Drive, usually had kids playing until dark, but that day even they'd given up. I kicked off my scrubs in the laundry room and was heading upstairs when everything went dark. At first I thought maybe I'd blown a fuse running too many things at once. The AC was cranked, I had the washing machine going, the TV was still on. But when I looked out the window, the entire street was pitch black. Not a single porch light, no glow from anyone's windows, nothing. The power outages had been happening more frequently that summer with everyone maxing out the grid, but this was the first time it hit our neighborhood. I fumbled for my phone, grateful for the small bit of light from the screen. It was only 7:30, still technically daylight, but the house felt cave dark with all the blinds closed against the heat. I texted my friend Melissa, who lived 2 streets over, to see if her power was out too, but the message wouldn't send, no signal. That should have been my first real warning. but I just figured the cell towers were overloaded with everyone trying to report the outage. I made my way to the kitchen, using my phone flashlight to find the drawer where I kept candles and matches, thinking this would just be a minor inconvenience. I was lighting the third candle when I heard it. 3 sharp knocks at the front door. Not the friendly rat-a-tat-tat my neighbors usually did, but 3 deliberate, spaced-out pounds that seemed to echo through the silent house. I nearly dropped the match. Who would be going door to door in this heat, especially with the power out? I waited, holding my breath, the match burning down toward my fingers until I had to blow it out. Then came the voice, muffled through the door but clearly male. "Power company, ma'am. Need to check your meter, make sure there's no damage to the lines." His accent was hard to place, not quite local, but trying to sound like it. The way he said ma'am dragged out too long, like he was tasting the word. I set the matches down quietly and crept toward the front door, avoiding the squeaky floorboard near the stairs that Kayla always stepped on when she snuck down for midnight snacks. Through the peephole, I could barely make out a figure in the dying daylight, tall, wearing what looked like a uniform, but no utility truck in the driveway. Just a beat-up sedan parked across the street that I'd never seen before. He knocked again, harder this time, and I watched his head turn slowly, scanning the windows like he was trying to see inside. "I know you're in there," he called out, and my chest tightened. "Saw you come home earlier. Just need 5 minutes to check the meter box. Make sure your breaker didn't cause the outage." That's when it hit me. How could the power company already know about an outage that happened maybe 10 minutes ago? How could they have sent someone this fast? And meters are outside anyway. He didn't need me to open the door for that. I backed away from the door, my bare feet silent on the hardwood, when I heard something that made every muscle in my body go rigid. From the kitchen, coming from the back of the house, there was the softest click, the sound my back door made when the handle turned. My mind went into overdrive, processing what this meant. The back door had been locked. I always locked it, especially since the divorce, especially when Kayla wasn't home. But there it was, that distinctive click of the latch releasing. Then silence. Whoever was back there was being careful, moving slow. The man at the front door knocked again, louder, more aggressive. "Ma'am, this is urgent. We've had reports of electrical fires in the neighborhood. I need to ensure your safety." His voice had changed, lost its fake friendly tone. Now it sounded irritated, impatient. I could hear him trying the door handle, rattling it. Thank God I'd locked it out of habit. My phone showed 15% battery. I'd forgotten to charge it at work. No signal, no way to call 911. The candles I'd lit in the kitchen were casting dancing shadows on the walls, and I realized they were basically advertising exactly where I was in the house. The smart thing would have been to blow out the candles, but that would mean going back toward the kitchen, toward whoever had just come through my back door. Instead, I moved toward the stairs, placing each foot with the careful precision I'd learned from years of checking on Kayla without waking her. The third step creaked. It always did. But I shifted my weight to the edge where the wood met the wall. From downstairs, I heard the back door close with a gentle thud, so quiet I might have missed it if I hadn't been straining to hear every sound. Then footsteps, slow and measured, moving through my kitchen. Not the heavy boots you'd expect from a utility worker, but something softer, like sneakers. The man outside had gone quiet. No more knocking, no more talking. That terrified me more than the yelling had. It meant they were coordinating, probably communicating somehow. I reached the top of the stairs and had to make a choice. My bedroom with its lock that Kayla had broken last month wrestling with her cousin, or the bathroom with its tiny window that faced the neighbor's house. I chose the bathroom, slipping inside and turning the lock as quietly as possible. The window was one of those frosted glass types, maybe 18 inches square, meant for ventilation, not escape. But the Jeffersons' house was right there, maybe 15 feet away. If I could get their attention somehow. I tried to slide the window open, but it stuck, painted shut from the previous owner years ago. My fingernails bent backward as I tried to force it, the pain sharp enough to make me bite down on my lip to keep from crying out. Downstairs, I could hear drawers being opened in the kitchen, the metallic slide of silverware being moved around. They were searching for something, or maybe just making noise to scare me, to let me know they were there. Then I heard the stairs creak, that third step, the one I'd just carefully avoided. But whoever was coming up didn't know the trick, didn't know to step on the edge. The sound was loud in the quiet house, and it was followed by a pause, like they were listening for my reaction. I grabbed the toilet tank lid, the porcelain heavy and solid in my hands. It was the only weapon I could think of. My phone screen had gone dark to save battery, and I didn't dare turn it back on. The light might show under the door. Another step creaked, then another. Slow, methodical, taking their time. They knew I was trapped up here. Then, from right outside the bathroom door, I heard breathing. Not heavy or labored, just calm, patient breathing, like someone standing perfectly still and listening. My own breath caught in my throat, and I pressed my back against the far wall, holding the tank lid across my chest like a shield. The doorknob turned slightly, testing. The lock held, but these interior doors weren't meant for security. Hollow core, the kind you could probably put your fist through if you really wanted. "Found her," a voice said, different from the one at the front door. This one was younger, almost excited, like this was some kind of game. "Second floor bathroom." He was talking to someone, maybe on a radio or phone, which meant their signals were working just fine. The handle stopped turning, and for a moment there was silence. Then I heard him walk away, his footsteps heading toward my bedroom. I could hear him opening drawers, throwing things around. Looking for valuables? Or just trying to make me think he'd moved on? Heavy footsteps came up the stairs now, the first man from the front door. "Jewelry's in the bedroom usually," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. "Check the closet, top shelf. That's where they always hide the good stuff." They were talking like I wasn't even there, like I was already dealt with. My legs were shaking so bad I had to concentrate on keeping them locked so I wouldn't slide down the wall. Then the younger one laughed, and it was such a normal sound, like he was hanging out with friends, that it made everything worse. "Hey, there's kid stuff in here," he called out. "Toys and things. She got kids?" The first man's response made my entire body go numb. "Saw a girl leaving with some guy a few days ago. Figured she'd be alone for a while. They'd been watching my house. Watching me. Knew when Kayla left with her father, knew my schedule. This wasn't random, they'd picked me specifically, planned this." The bathroom felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were closing in. I could hear them tearing through my bedroom now, the sound of my jewelry box hitting the floor, change scattering from the dish on my nightstand. One of them was at my closet, hangers scraping against the rod as he pushed through my clothes. "Check if she's got a safe," the older voice said. Behind pictures, in the closet floor, places like that. They were so casual, so practiced. How many houses had they done this to? Then the younger one said something that sent ice through my veins. "What do you want to do about her?" There was a pause, and I held my breath, pressing my ear against the door. "Let's get what we came for first," the older one replied. "She's not going anywhere. We cut the phone lines before the power went out, and I've got her car keys from the kitchen counter. Even if she runs to a neighbor, we'll be gone before anybody can do anything." That's when something inside me shifted. The fear was still there, but underneath it, something else sparked. Anger maybe, or just the refusal to be a victim in my own home. I thought about Kayla, about how I'd fought through a messy divorce, double shifts, and single motherhood. I wasn't going to cower in my bathroom waiting for whatever they decided to do with me. I remembered something my dad taught me when I was young. People expect you to be where they last saw you. They'd heard me in the bathroom, so that's where they assumed I'd stay. Moving as silently as I could, I set down the toilet lid and turned the bathtub faucet on just slightly, enough to make a gentle dripping sound. Then I unlocked the door with painful slowness, turning the mechanism one tiny click at a time. The hallway was dark, but I knew every inch of this house. I could hear them still ransacking my bedroom, arguing now about whether to check the attic. I slipped out and moved toward Kayla's room at the end of the hall, the carpet muffling my footsteps. Her window faced the big oak tree in our yard, the one she'd begged me to let her build a treehouse in. Kayla's room smelled like the strawberry body spray she'd started wearing, convinced it made her seem older. I navigated around her soccer bag and the pile of clothes she never put away, reaching her window. This one I knew would open. She snuck out through it last month to meet friends at the park, not knowing I'd heard everything. The window slid up almost silently, and the evening air hit me like a wall of heat. The tree branch was about 4 feet away, the one Kayla used to shimmy down. But she was 13 and fearless, probably 90 pounds soaking wet. I was pushing 40 and hadn't climbed a tree since middle school. Behind me, I heard footsteps in the hallway. "Hey, water's running in there," the younger voice said. "She trying to call for help or something?" Laughter from the older one. "What's she gonna do, send a message in a bottle?" But I could hear them moving toward the bathroom. In seconds, they'd realize I wasn't there. I didn't think anymore, just climbed out onto the window ledge, my bare feet finding purchase on the wooden siding, and jumped for the branch. My hands hit bark, and I grabbed on with everything I had, my legs swinging wildly underneath me. The branch dipped with my weight but held. My palms were screaming, already torn up, but I managed to swing my leg over and pull myself up. Through the window, I heard the bathroom door slam open. "She's not here." The younger one sounded panicked now. "Check the other rooms, she's gotta be hiding." I didn't wait to hear more. I half climbed, half fell down that tree, branches catching my shirt, scratching my arms and face. 8 feet from the ground, I just let go and dropped, hitting the lawn hard enough to knock the wind out of me. But I was out. I was free. I ran barefoot across my yard toward the Jeffersons' house, not caring about the rocks and sticks stabbing into my feet. Their porch light was off too, but I pounded on their door anyway, screaming for help. Behind me, I could see flashlight beams in Kayla's window. They were looking for me, trying to figure out how I'd vanished. George Jefferson answered the door holding a baseball bat, his wife Nancy right behind him with their German Shepherd Rex growling at her side. "Call 911, I gasped out. "2 men in my house, they cut the phone lines, they have my car keys." George pulled me inside while Nancy ran for their landline. Theirs still worked, thank God. Within minutes, we heard sirens. The 2 men must have heard them too because George saw them sprint out my back door and take off in that beat-up sedan. The cops caught them 3 blocks away, pulled over for running a stop sign. My grandmother's jewelry and my laptop still in their back seat. Turned out they were brothers from Oklahoma, who'd been hitting suburbs across Texas for months, studying routines, waiting for people to be alone. The older one had done time before for home invasion. The younger one was barely 19. They'd been using signal jammers to block cell towers in targeted areas, making it look like power outage complications. The police said I was lucky. Most of their victims had been too scared to move, just hid until they left. But they also told me something that still gives me nightmares. They found rope and zip ties in the trunk of their car. Whatever they'd been planning to do after robbing me, I don't want to know. Kayla came home the next day, and I held her so tight she complained she couldn't breathe. We stayed with the Jeffersons for a week while I had new locks installed, a security system put in, motion lights everywhere. Even now, 6 months later, I still check every window twice before bed, and I keep a phone charger in every room. But mostly, I'm just grateful I trusted that instinct that told me to run, to fight, to not be the victim they expected me to be. The 6 train always smelled like wet metal and disappointment after 11 at night, but I needed to get from the Bronx back to my studio in Chinatown after helping my brother move his stuff out of his ex-girlfriend's place. Jamie had just turned 41, 3 years older than me, and watching him load boxes into that U-Haul with tears streaming down his face made me want to punch something. The platform at Hunts Point Avenue Station was nearly empty when I got there around midnight. Just me, a nurse still in scrubs checking her phone, and 2 drunk guys in Yankees jerseys arguing about batting averages. When the train finally screeched to a stop, I grabbed a seat in the middle car and tried not to think about how my own relationship was heading the same direction as Jamie's. The car was surprisingly crowded for a Monday night. Maybe 30 people scattered across the orange plastic seats, most of them staring at their phones or sleeping against the windows. We were somewhere under the East River when everything went wrong, probably halfway between Manhattan and Brooklyn based on how long we'd been moving through that endless tunnel. The train lurched hard enough to throw a standing passenger into a pole. Then the lights flickered 3 times before dying completely, leaving us in the kind of darkness you forget exists in the city. The emergency lighting didn't kick in, which should have been my first real warning that this wasn't just another MTA breakdown. My ears popped from the sudden pressure change, and the silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat competing with the quiet breathing of strangers around me. People started murmuring, nervous laughs bubbling up here and there, everyone waiting for an announcement that never came. The conductor's booth stayed dark, no static from the speakers, no explanation, just the weight of all that earth and water pressing down above us while we sat trapped in a metal tube. After maybe 2 minutes of nothing, phones started lighting up like fireflies, their weak glow barely cutting through the black. A woman across from me was already dialing 911, but she kept pulling the phone away from her ear, shaking her head. No signal down here, obviously. The guy next to me, wearing a Knicks hoodie and reeking of bourbon, kept pressing the emergency call button above the door, the plastic clicking uselessly with each push. That's when someone at the far end of our car stood up and started walking toward the door that connected to the last car, their phone flashlight sweeping back and forth across the floor. I heard them try the handle, metal scraping against metal, and then their voice cut through the darkness high and thin like they were trying not to scream. "There's something on the window," they said, and every conversation in our car stopped at once. Jesus Christ, I think it's blood. The panic hit like a wave, people jumping up from their seats, more flashlights snapping on, everyone trying to see what this person was talking about. I stayed put, gripping the cold metal bar beside my seat hard enough to hurt, while a cluster of passengers pushed toward the back to look. Their lights converged on the small window in the door between cars, and I could see their shadows shifting, hear their voices rising. A heavy-set man in a security guard uniform pushed through them and pressed his face close to the glass, shining his light through to the other side. He stumbled backward so fast he knocked 2 people over, and the way his face looked in the phone lights, eyes wide, mouth working without making sounds, made my chest tighten. "The last car," he finally managed to say, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "There's nobody in the last car, but there's blood everywhere. On the seats, the floor, the windows, like someone painted with it." Before anyone could process what that meant, we heard it. Footsteps outside the train, in the tunnel itself, slow and deliberate on the gravel between the tracks. They were coming from behind us, from the direction of the bloody car, getting closer with each step. The nurse I'd seen on the platform pressed herself against the opposite door, her scrubs rustling as she fumbled with her phone, trying again for a signal that wouldn't come. The footsteps stopped right outside our car, and for 10 seconds that felt like hours. We all held our breath, waiting. Then came the knocking, 3 measured taps on the window closest to me, so controlled and patient it made my teeth hurt. I turned my head slowly, my neck muscles fighting me the whole way, and saw a hand pressed against the glass from outside, leaving dark streaks that could only be one thing. The hand was wearing a latex glove, the medical kind, stretched tight and stained crimson up to the wrist. The knocking moved down the length of our car, 3 taps at each window, that gloved hand leaving bloody prints on every surface it touched. A woman near the middle doors started sobbing, pressing her palms over her ears, while her boyfriend wrapped his arms around her and stared at the ceiling like he was praying. When the knocking reached the door between our car and the bloody one, it stopped, and we heard metal scraping against metal like someone was trying to pry open the door from outside. The security guard pulled out a box cutter from his belt, probably the most worthless weapon you could have right then, but at least it was something. He positioned himself between us and the door, legs spread wide like he was ready to tackle whatever came through. The scraping got louder, more insistent, and then we heard something that made everyone in that car start backing away toward the front. A voice from outside, muffled by the tunnel walls but clear enough to understand, singing "Ring Around the Rosie" in a child's melody. Except the words were all wrong. Something about trains and tunnels and things that wait in the dark. The drunk guys in Yankees jerseys tried to force open the doors on the opposite side of the train, throwing their shoulders against them, kicking at the rubber seals. But those doors were designed to stay locked between stations. One of them picked up a fire extinguisher from under a seat and started hammering at a window, the glass spiderwebbing but refusing to shatter, each hit echoing through the car like a gunshot. That's when the lights in the tunnel came on. Not the regular lights, but emergency work lights, harsh and yellow, mounted every 50 feet or so along the walls. What we saw made everyone stop moving, stop breathing, stop everything. There were people in the tunnel, maybe a dozen of them, all wearing those paper medical gowns you get at hospitals, the kind that tie in the back. They were standing perfectly still along both walls, facing our train, their faces covered with surgical masks pulled up over their eyes like blindfolds. Each one had their arms at their sides, palms facing forward, and their hospital gowns were soaked through with what looked like blood, dripping onto the tracks below them. A teenager with a skateboard started hyperventilating, dropping to his knees in the aisle, while an older woman pulled out a rosary and began whispering prayers in Spanish. The security guard backed away from the door, his hand with the box cutter shaking so bad he dropped it twice trying to fold it closed. Those people outside didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe, just stood there like mannequins while we watched them through the windows. Then, all at once, like they were following some signal we couldn't hear, they raised their right hands and pointed at our car, every single one of them, in perfect synchronization. The singing started again, but now it was coming from all of them. A chorus of voices echoing off the tunnel walls, getting louder and louder until it felt like the sound was inside my skull. The nurse suddenly screamed and pointed at the floor. There was liquid seeping in under the doors, dark and thick, pooling around our feet, and the smell hit us all at once, copper and rot and something chemical underneath, like formaldehyde. People started climbing onto the seats trying to get away from the spreading liquid. But there was nowhere to go in that metal box. The man in the Knicks hoodie next to me grabbed my shoulder, his bourbon breath hot in my face, screaming that we needed to get to the front car, that we needed to move now. But when we looked toward the door leading forward, there were shadows moving on the other side of the window, more of those hospital gown figures pressed against the glass, their covered faces tilted at impossible angles like broken dolls. The train suddenly shuddered, a mechanical groan running through the whole structure, and the emergency brakes released with a hiss that sounded like the car itself was dying. We started rolling backward, slowly at first, then picking up speed, heading back the way we came but with no driver, no power, just gravity or something else pulling us deeper into the tunnel. The lights outside flashed by faster and faster, strobing through the windows, and in each flash I could see those figures in hospital gowns running alongside the train, keeping pace with us, their arms pumping mechanically, their heads never moving. The guy with the fire extinguisher lost it completely, screaming about how this was some kind of government experiment, how they were using the subway tunnels for medical testing, how we were all going to end up like whatever was in that last car. He swung the extinguisher at anyone who came near him, catching a young woman in a Columbia University sweatshirt across the shoulder, sending her sprawling into that awful liquid on the floor. The security guard tried to calm him down, but the guy turned and sprayed him full in the face with foam, white chemical clouds filling the car, making it even harder to see or breathe. Through the chaos, I heard the nurse shouting something about recognizing the smell, about formaldehyde and tissue preservation, about how she'd worked at Mount Sinai's morgue during her residency. And this was exactly what the basement storage area smelled like after a power failure in summer, when the cooling systems failed and everything started to decompose. The train kept accelerating backward, and someone near the rear door started pounding on it, screaming that they could see lights ahead, or behind us technically, like we were approaching a station. The train slammed to a stop so hard that everyone went flying. I hit the pole in front of me chest first, feeling ribs crack while bodies piled up against the rear door in a tangle of limbs and screams. The lights outside went out again, leaving us in complete darkness except for a few phone flashlights still working, their beams cutting through the chemical fog from the fire extinguisher. For maybe 30 seconds, there was no sound except groaning and crying, people trying to untangle themselves, checking for injuries. Then the doors opened, not just unlocked, but sliding wide open with their normal mechanical whir, even though the power was supposedly dead. Fresh air rushed in, mixing with the formaldehyde stench, and we could hear the echo of a massive space beyond the train. People started pushing toward the doors, desperate to get out, but the nurse grabbed anyone she could reach, shouting that we didn't know where we were, that this wasn't a normal station. She was right. When I finally made it to a door and looked out, we were in some kind of underground warehouse, concrete walls stretching up into darkness, industrial lights hanging from chains, and rows upon rows of metal tables covered with white sheets. The sheets weren't flat. They had shapes underneath them, human shapes, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, laid out like we'd rolled into some kind of mass morgue. The passengers who'd already left the train were standing frozen on the platform, staring at the tables, some of them backing slowly toward the train again. That's when the sheets started moving, not all at once but in waves, like something was waking up underneath them. The man in the Knicks hoodie whispered "no" over and over, grabbing my arm so tight I thought he'd cut off circulation. One by one, bodies sat up under those sheets, the fabric falling away to reveal people in various states of decay, some fresh, some skeletal, all wearing hospital bracelets with dates from the past week. They turned their heads toward us in unison, empty eye sockets and clouded eyes all focusing on our train. And then they started climbing off the tables, their movements jerky and wrong, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. The security guard shoved everyone back into the train car, screaming at people to get inside, that we needed to close the doors, but the doors wouldn't respond to the emergency buttons, staying wide open while those things stumbled closer, their hospital gowns. The same gowns as the figures in the tunnel, trailing behind them like wings. Just when the first wave of bodies reached the platform edge, maybe 10 feet from our doors, the train's emergency system kicked in. A recorded announcement blared through speakers we thought were dead, telling us to remain calm, that transit police had been notified, that we'd be moving shortly. The doors snapped shut so fast they nearly caught the security guard's arm, and the train lurched forward, not backward this time, accelerating smooth and normal like nothing had happened. The lights flickered back on, bright fluorescent normal subway lighting, and suddenly we were just sitting in a regular train car again, covered in foam from the fire extinguisher, bruised and terrified but moving. Through the windows we could see normal tunnel walls flashing by, the familiar orange emergency lights every 100 feet. No sign of those figures in hospital gowns or that underground warehouse. We burst out of the tunnel into Canal Street Station 3 minutes later, the platform full of waiting passengers who stepped back when they saw us stumble out. 30 people covered in blood and chemicals, some crying, some still screaming, all of us looking like we'd crawled out of hell. The cops who showed up 20 minutes later didn't believe a word of it, of course. They found the blood in the last car, ran DNA tests that came back matching 7 different missing persons from the past month, all of them last seen in the subway system. But when they sent teams back into that tunnel with the MTA maintenance crews, they found nothing. No warehouse, no bodies, no evidence of anyone being in the tunnel at all except for some scuff marks on the walls. The official report blamed a combination of mechanical failure and mass hysteria, suggested the blood was from an unrelated incident that happened to coincide with the blackout. They closed that section of track for 3 weeks for maintenance, and when it reopened, they'd installed new lighting, new emergency systems, new everything. I moved out of the city 2 months later, couldn't handle taking the subway anymore, couldn't stop thinking about those clouded eyes and jerky movements. But sometimes I check the news and every few months there's another story. A train stops unexpectedly in that same tunnel. Passengers report strange noises outside. Someone claims they saw figures in hospital gowns through the windows. The MTA always has an explanation, always mentions track work or signal problems, but I know what's really down there, waiting in the dark between stations, and I know it's only a matter of time before those doors open again at the wrong platform. My fourth espresso was burning its way down my throat in the break room at Cedars Medical Center when I checked my phone. 6:13 in the morning, February something. Couldn't even remember the exact date anymore. 18 hours into what should have been a 14-hour shift, and my body had stopped belonging to me months ago. First-year surgical intern meant you became property of whoever was coding, crashing, or bleeding out on any given table. Yesterday's blood still decorated my scrubs because finding time for laundry between rounds was like finding a unicorn in the parking garage. Dr. Harrison liked to say interns ran on pure caffeine and stubbornness, and after 6 months of this grinding routine, my reflection in the bathroom mirror was starting to prove him right. By 7 that Monday morning, the ER was already chaos incarnate, with Harrison commanding the floor like a general watching his troops fall one by one. Those harsh fluorescent lights turned everyone into walking corpses, which pretty much described those of us who hadn't seen our own beds in 48 hours. Angela Ramirez burst through the emergency doors around 9:30, her screams cutting through the usual morning pandemonium like a knife through tissue. Amniotic fluid had soaked through her yellow maternity dress, and she was sobbing that her husband Carlos was trapped somewhere on the 405, that the baby wasn't due for 3 more weeks, that something was wrong, really wrong. Dr. Harrison took one glance at the fetal monitor, and his jaw clenched in that way that meant we were about to lose someone if we didn't move fast. The baby's heart rate was plummeting, classic signs of cord strangulation, and we had maybe 5 minutes before brain damage became irreversible. Harrison's grip on my shoulder left marks through my scrubs as he shouted for OR3 to be prepped immediately, that we were cutting now. No time for anything fancy. Angela kept grabbing at my hands, begging me to save her baby, her voice growing fainter as we raced toward surgery, and all I could focus on was how her nail polish was this perfect coral pink, probably painted special for meeting her child. Inside OR3, everything moved with the precision of a Swiss watch. Nurses counting instruments, anesthesiologist calling out vitals, Harrison scrubbing in while rattling off orders faster than I could process them. Angela was fading in and out of consciousness as they positioned her on the table, her lips moving in what looked like a prayer, though no sound came out anymore. Harrison made the first incision at 9:43. I remember because I kept glancing at the wall clock, watching each second tick by like a countdown to disaster. Blood welled up immediately, more than normal, and Harrison muttered something about placental abruption that made my chest tighten with dread. We were halfway through the procedure, Harrison's hands working inside Angela's open abdomen to free the baby, when I felt it, a subtle shift in the floor beneath my feet, like standing on a boat deck. For a split second, nobody moved, everyone's eyes meeting across Angela's draped body, and then the whole world exploded into violent motion. Everything happened at once, surgical instruments clattering off trays, IV poles swaying like drunken dancers, and that horrible grinding sound of concrete fighting against itself somewhere deep in the building's bones. An earthquake, my brain registered dimly, even as my hands instinctively pressed down on Angela's abdomen to keep the incision stable. Harrison was shouting to maintain sterile field, to keep going, that we couldn't stop now with the baby half delivered. But the lights started flickering like a horror movie strobe effect. One of the nurses, Bethany I think, lost her balance and crashed into the instrument table, sending scalpels and forceps flying across the floor in a metallic rainfall. The building groaned and swayed, and I could hear car alarms going off in the parking structure, mixing with screams from other operating rooms down the hall. Then, With a sound like God flipping a switch, everything went completely, utterly black. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved or breathed. The darkness so complete I couldn't see my own hands, even though they were still buried in Angela's open belly. Then the emergency generator kicked in with a mechanical roar from somewhere below us, and those blessed red emergency lights bathed everything in a hellish glow that was better than nothing. Harrison's face looked demonic in that crimson light, his eyes wild as he screamed at me to retract, to hold steady while he pulled the baby free. Angela's blood was everywhere now, pooling on the floor where the earthquake had knocked over the suction equipment. And the baby, God, the baby was purple, the cord wrapped twice around its tiny neck like a noose. Another aftershock hit just as Harrison got his hands around the infant's shoulders, sending everyone stumbling again, and I had to physically throw myself across Angela's legs to keep her from sliding off the tilted table. That's when the generator started making a sound I'll never forget. A high-pitched whining like a dying animal, followed by 3 loud bangs that shook the whole floor. Complete darkness again, but this time it was different. Final somehow. No mechanical roar promising salvation, no emergency lights flickering back to life, just the raw black of a tomb while Angela bled and bled beneath my trembling fingers. Someone's phone, turned out to be mine, had fallen from my pocket during the first quake, and Bethany grabbed it, turning on the flashlight with shaking hands that made shadows dance like demons on the walls. In that narrow beam of white light, I could see Harrison hadn't stopped working, his hands moving by pure muscle memory and decades of experience, unwrapping the cord from the baby's neck while counting compressions under his breath. Angela's pulse was getting weaker under my palm, her blood pressure dropping so fast the manual monitor couldn't keep up, and we all knew what that meant. She was bleeding internally, probably from where the placenta had torn, and without power for the cauterizer or proper light to see what we were doing, we were just playing blind surgeon in a nightmare. The baby finally came free with a wet, horrible sound, limp and silent in Harrison's blood-slicked hands, and he thrust the tiny body at Bethany while turning back to Angela's hemorrhaging womb. Manual compressions on the uterus now. Harrison's voice cut through the darkness like a whip, and my hands moved before my brain could catch up, plunging into Angela's abdomen to find her uterus and squeeze, trying to stop the bleeding through sheer pressure. The phone's flashlight beam jumped wildly as Bethany tried to work on the baby one-handed, clearing airways, starting chest compressions with her thumb and index finger on that impossibly small chest. I could feel Angela's life pumping out between my fingers, warm and unstoppable, while Harrison packed gauze after gauze into the cavity, working by touch alone in the spaces where the light couldn't reach. Another aftershock rattled the building, weaker this time but still strong enough to send more equipment crashing, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the fire alarm going off, adding its shriek to the symphony of chaos. The anesthesiologist, Kevin, his name finally came to me, was manually bagging Angela, counting out loud to keep rhythm while tears streamed down his face in the phone's harsh light. Then, cutting through all that noise and terror, came the most beautiful sound I've ever heard, a tiny, angry wail from the baby in Bethany's arms. She'd gotten the infant breathing, and that cry meant brain function, meant hope, meant at least one of them might make it out of this darkness alive. But Angela was fading fast, her skin already taking on that waxy look that meant she'd lost too much blood, and Harrison was running out of options. "We need to get her to another OR somewhere with power," he said, but we all knew that was impossible. The hallways were pitch black, probably full of debris, and moving her would mean certain death. That's when I remembered something from my emergency training, something so basic it was almost stupid, but desperate times and all that. My car was in the parking structure, and I always kept jumper cables and a portable battery pack in the trunk. Not enough to power an OR, but maybe, just maybe, enough to run a single cauterizer for the 30 seconds we'd need to seal the worst bleeders. Harrison didn't hesitate, just nodded and kept packing while I explained my insane plan to Kevin, who was already pulling off his surgical gown to make the run with me. We left Bethany with the baby and Harrison keeping pressure on Angela's wounds, and we ran through those black corridors like our lives depended on it. Which they didn't, but Angela's did. The emergency stairs were a death trap of fallen ceiling tiles and broken glass, and we had to feel our way down 9 flights in complete darkness, guided only by the backup light on Kevin's phone. The parking structure was worse. Cars scattered at weird angles from the quake, some with alarms still blaring, others with windows shattered across the concrete. My little Ford was on level 3, thankfully still in one piece, and we tore open the trunk like maniacs, grabbing the battery pack, jumper cables, and anything else that looked useful. Kevin found a camping lantern I'd forgotten about, one of those LED things that could light up a whole room, and we grabbed that too before sprinting back through the maze of destruction. Getting back up took forever, or at least it felt that way, each second stretching like an hour while Angela bled out 9 floors above us. Kevin went ahead with the lantern, clearing a path through the debris, while I followed with the battery pack clutched against my chest like a newborn. We could hear people calling for help from behind locked doors, probably staff and patients trapped when the automatic locks engaged during the power failure. But we couldn't stop. Not now. When we finally burst back into OR3, the scene that greeted us was something from a war zone. Blood everywhere. Harrison working by the light of 3 phones now propped at different angles. Bethany doing her best to keep both the baby warm and assist Harrison simultaneously. Angela was still breathing, barely, but her blood pressure was almost non-existent. And Harrison's face told me everything I needed to know about her chances. We had maybe 2 minutes, probably less. Kevin and I rigged up the battery pack to the cauterizer in 45 seconds flat, our hands working on pure autopilot, while Harrison identified the 3 main bleeders by touch. The LED lantern lit up the OR like a stage, throwing our giant shadows on the walls as we worked, and for the first time since the power died, Harrison could actually see what he was doing. The cauterizer came to life with a buzz that sounded like angels singing, and Harrison went to work with the precision of a master craftsman, sealing off vessels while I maintained pressure and Kevin pushed unit after unit of O- into Angela's remaining IV line. Each sealed vessel meant less blood loss, meant her pressure starting to stabilize, meant hope creeping back into that room one careful burn at a time. Bethany had wrapped the baby in warming blankets from the crash cart, and its cries had gotten stronger, angrier, more insistent. The sound of life demanding attention. We worked in perfect synchronization, no words needed, just hands moving in a choreography born from training and desperation. By the time the battery pack died 17 minutes later, we'd done it. The major bleeding was controlled, Angela's vitals were stabilizing, and both mother and baby were alive. Real help arrived 20 minutes after that. Firefighters with generators and emergency medical teams who'd finally cleared a path through the collapsed sections of the hospital. They evacuated Angela to UCLA Medical Center, which still had power, where she spent 3 weeks in the ICU but eventually walked out carrying her daughter. They named her Hope, which felt right considering everything. Harrison put me in for a commendation, said I'd shown the kind of thinking that makes great surgeons, but honestly, I just did what anyone would have done when lives were hanging in the balance. Sometimes I still dream about that darkness, about the warmth of Angela's blood between my fingers, about how close we came to losing them both. But then I remember that angry little cry cutting through the chaos, and I remind myself that sometimes, even in the absolute worst moments, human stubbornness and a camping lantern are enough to beat the odds. Sunday afternoon at Dauphine Street Clinic started like any other overtime shift, with me checking vitals and restocking supplies while rain tapped against the windows. I'd been a paramedic in New Orleans for 6 years by then, started right after my 26th birthday, and we'd seen our share of storms roll through. Our clinic occupied one of those old converted townhouses, 3 stories of peeling paint and creaky floors that somehow kept passing inspection year after year. We had 12 patients on the first floor that day, mostly elderly folks who couldn't make it to the bigger hospitals, and just me and 2 nurses. Donna, who'd been doing this since before I was born, and Jasmine, fresh from nursing school with that nervous energy newcomers always carry. Weather reports kept changing every hour, first saying the storm would veer east, then west, then suddenly admitting they had no clue where this monster was heading. By 3 in the afternoon, the street outside had turned into a river. I watched through the window as a shopping cart floated past, followed by someone's patio furniture, the white plastic chairs bobbing like boats. Water was climbing the steps to our entrance faster than I'd ever seen, brownish gray and carrying all kinds of debris. Donna kept checking on old Walter in bed 3, who needed oxygen constantly, while Jasmine helped me move supplies to the second floor, just in case, we told ourselves. Each gust of wind made the building groan like it was in pain, and I could hear water starting to seep through the 100-year-old window frames. That's when dispatch called saying all units were being pulled back to higher ground. But when I looked outside at the current rushing past our door, I knew we'd missed our window to leave safely. Water started pushing under the front door around 4, spreading across the linoleum like spilled coffee in slow motion. I grabbed towels from the supply closet, but it was like trying to stop a river with tissue paper. Within minutes, the floor was covered in an inch of murky water that smelled like sewage and motor oil. Jasmine's voice cracked when she called out from the main ward. The water was coming through the back entrance too, pooling around the wheels of the beds. We had maybe 30 minutes before the first floor would be completely flooded, and half our patients couldn't even walk. There was Eleanor with her broken hip, Walter on his oxygen tank, and Mr. Briggs, who'd had a stroke last month and could barely move his left side. I remember standing there for a second, water soaking through my boots, calculating how many trips up the narrow staircase it would take to move everyone. Donna took charge like she always did in a crisis, her voice cutting through the sound of rushing water and howling wind. She assigned Jasmine to start disconnecting the mobile patients from their IVs, while she prepped the medical equipment we'd need upstairs. I started with Eleanor, sliding my arms under her frail body, while she whimpered about the cold water touching her legs. The staircase was barely wide enough for one person, let alone carrying someone, and the old wood was already slippery from the humidity. Each step creaked under our combined weight, and I had to stop twice to readjust my grip, Eleanor's fingers digging into my shoulder like bird claws. When I finally got her settled in a second-floor room and rushed back down, the water had risen another 3 inches. Through the window, I saw a car float by, its alarm still somehow blaring underwater, the red lights flashing beneath the surface like some kind of drowning emergency beacon. We managed to get 6 patients upstairs before the lights started flickering. Every time they dimmed, my chest tightened, knowing what would happen if we lost power completely. The elevator was already out of the question. Nobody trusted that ancient cage in good weather, let alone during a flood. Jasmine and I tried to move Walter next, but his oxygen tank weighed almost as much as he did. We had to carry him in his wheelchair to the stairs. Then I held him up while Jasmine lugged the tank, step by agonizing step. His breathing was getting shallower, whistling through the tubes, and halfway up, he grabbed my arm and gasped that he couldn't breathe. We had to stop right there on the landing, Jasmine fumbling with the oxygen flow while I held Walter upright, the water below us now reaching the 3rd step and climbing fast. I could hear things floating around down there, medical equipment, furniture, files, all churning in that dark soup that used to be our clinic floor. That's when the transformer outside exploded. The flash lit up the whole street for a second, bright white like lightning had struck right outside our window, and then everything went black. Not just regular dark, the kind of thick, heavy darkness that presses against your eyes and makes you wonder if they're even open. The sound of water suddenly seemed louder, closer, like it was right behind us in the stairwell. Jasmine let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream but close enough, and Walter's grip on my arm turned painful. I had my phone in my pocket, fumbled for it with one hand while holding Walter with the other, and when I finally got the flashlight on, the beam was pathetically weak against all that darkness. In that thin circle of light, I could see Jasmine's face pale and terrified, and Walter's eyes wide with panic. Below us, the water kept rising, and we still had 5 more patients down there, including Mr. Briggs, who couldn't move without help, and a woman named Ruth who'd just had surgery 3 days ago. We got Walter to the 2nd floor, but I could hear Donna yelling from below, her voice competing with the roar of water that was now pouring through the windows. I left Jasmine with Walter and practically fell down the stairs in the dark, using my phone's light to navigate. The 1st floor was a nightmare, water up to my thighs, cold and powerful enough to knock me sideways when I stepped off the last stair. Donna was waist-deep near Mr. Briggs' bed, trying to lift him while Ruth clung to her bed rails, crying. The water had this current to it, pulling everything toward the back of the building, and debris kept hitting my legs. Clipboards, medicine bottles, someone's shoe. I waded over to help Donna, and together we got Mr. Briggs sitting up, but he was dead weight on his left side. His good arm wrapped around my neck so tight I could barely breathe, and Donna and I had to coordinate every move to keep him above water. The smell was overwhelming, sewage and chemicals and something else, something rotten that made me want to gag. Getting him to the stairs was like moving through molasses while someone threw punches at your legs. Every piece of floating furniture became an obstacle, every step a gamble on whether the floor was still there, or if you were about to step into a hole. When we finally reached the staircase, I realized the horrible truth. We'd have to carry him up in complete darkness because I needed both hands to support his weight. I shoved my phone in my mouth, biting down on it to keep the light pointed forward, tasting the dirty water on the case. Donna went first, pulling Mr. Briggs' shoulders while I pushed from below, my back screaming with the effort. His body kept slipping, sliding back toward me, and twice I thought we were going to drop him. Behind us, I could hear Ruth still calling for help, her voice getting more desperate, and the sound of water climbing higher, swallowing more of our clinic with every passing second. After we got Mr. Briggs upstairs, I knew I had to go back for Ruth. But when I turned toward the stairs, Donna grabbed my arm with this grip that could have broken bone. Her face in the phone's light looked 20 years older than when the day started, and she was breathing hard, wheezing almost as bad as Walter had been. She told me the water was coming up too fast, that we needed to get everyone to the 3rd floor now because the 2nd floor wouldn't hold much longer. I could already hear it, water finding its way through the old building's bones, seeping through places we couldn't see. But Ruth was still down there, and I could hear her voice, weaker now, but still calling. I pulled away from Donna and headed back down, taking the stairs 3 at a time in the dark, my phone's battery icon showing red in the corner. The water hit my chest when I reached the bottom, cold enough to steal my breath, and the current was stronger, angrier, trying to sweep me toward the back of the building where I could hear windows breaking. Ruth was barely keeping her head above water when I found her, her arms wrapped around the bed's side rail, knuckles white even in the dim light. She'd had abdominal surgery, couldn't use her core muscles to pull herself up, and every wave that hit her face left her sputtering and gasping. I got behind her, hooked my arms under hers, and started pulling her toward the stairs, fighting the current with every step. Pieces of the ceiling were falling now, wet chunks of plaster that hit the water with heavy splashes. The building was coming apart around us, 100-year-old wood and plaster no match for the force of all that water. Ruth kept apologizing, saying she was sorry for being trouble, sorry for being heavy, and I wanted to tell her to save her breath, but I needed all of mine just to keep us moving. A filing cabinet floated past, spinning slowly like some kind of metal boat, and I had to push it away before it pinned us against the wall. My legs were going numb from the cold, and I couldn't tell if the floor was still there or if we were swimming. We made it to the stairs just as my phone died, plunging us into absolute darkness. Ruth was crying harder now, her breath coming in these short, panicked gasps that scared me more than the water. I had to feel for each step with my foot, pulling her up while she tried to help with her one good leg. The water was following us up. I could hear it splashing against the steps below, chasing us like something alive. Halfway up, Ruth went limp. Not unconscious, just exhausted, unable to help anymore. I had to practically drag her the rest of the way, my arms burning, lungs screaming for air I couldn't seem to get enough of. When we finally reached the second floor, Donna and Jasmine pulled us away from the stairs, and I collapsed on the wet floor, coughing up water I didn't remember swallowing. Through the window, I could see the streetlights were underwater now, still somehow glowing beneath the surface like giant jellyfish, and debris spinning past in the current. Someone's front door, a bicycle, things that used to belong to people's normal lives before today. We spent the next 6 hours huddled on the third floor, all 12 patients and us 3 workers crammed into 2 rooms while the building shook and creaked around us. The water stopped rising about a foot below the third floor, but we could hear it sloshing beneath us, testing the old floorboards. Walter's oxygen tank ran out around midnight, and we had to take turns manually pumping air into his lungs with a bag valve mask until the Coast Guard helicopter finally found us at dawn. They had to break through the roof to get us out, lifting patients one by one in a basket while the building swayed beneath us. I was the last one up, and as the helicopter pulled away, I looked back at the clinic, our clinic, now just a broken shell sticking out of the brown water. 3 people died in other buildings on our street that night, but we didn't lose anyone. Not one. Sometimes I still dream about that darkness, about the weight of carrying people up those stairs while the water chased us. But mostly I remember Donna's iron grip when she grabbed my arm, and how Ruth stopped apologizing once we got her safe, and how all of us, broken and scared and soaking wet, somehow made it through the longest night of our lives. The power went out around 7 that evening, right when I was heating up leftover Chinese food from the place down on Vermont Avenue. Living alone for the first time at 31 wasn't exactly where I thought I'd be after the divorce, but the apartment on the 4th floor had become my sanctuary, my little corner where I could finally breathe again. The microwave beeped once, then everything just died. The hum of the refrigerator, the air conditioning unit struggling against the September heat, even the faint buzz from the fluorescent light in the hallway outside. The building manager, Frank, had warned us about rolling blackouts with all the heat waves hitting the city lately. Said the grid couldn't handle everyone blasting their AC units at the same time. I grabbed my phone to check the power company's website, but the signal was barely crawling, probably because everyone in the neighborhood was doing the exact same thing. I lit a few candles I'd bought from the dollar store, vanilla and cinnamon, a weird combination, but they were on sale, and settled onto my couch with a book, figuring I might as well make the best of it. The apartment felt different in the candlelight, shadows dancing in corners I'd never noticed before, making familiar furniture look strange and distorted. Around 9, maybe 9:30, I heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy ones, like someone wearing work boots or something similar. Nothing unusual there. People came and went at all hours in this building, mostly young professionals and a few older couples who'd been here since the 90s. But then the footsteps stopped right outside my door, and I waited for the sound of keys jingling, a door opening, but nothing came. After maybe a minute, they continued up the stairs to the 5th floor, each step echoing in the silent building. The unit directly above mine, 5B, had been empty for 3 months after old Mr. Garrett moved to Phoenix to live with his daughter. That's when I heard it, a door closing upstairs followed by more footsteps. But these were different, softer, like someone trying not to make noise. The ceiling in my living room creaked in that specific way it does when someone walks across the floor above, a sound I'd gotten used to when Mr. Garrett lived there with his ancient cat Patches. My first thought was maybe Frank was showing the apartment to someone, even though 9 at night seemed like a strange time for that. But then again, people in this city worked weird hours. I went back to my book, some thriller I'd grabbed from the library about a woman who finds out her neighbor is a serial killer. Probably not the best choice for a blackout, but I was already halfway through. The footsteps continued for maybe 10 minutes, pacing back and forth, and then came this rhythmic tapping, like someone dropping marbles one by one onto the hardwood floor. The sound was oddly specific: 5 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, then 5 again, repeating over and over until I couldn't concentrate on reading anymore. I grabbed my phone to text Frank about someone being in 5B, but my battery was at 12% and still no signal. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by complete silence that somehow felt heavier than before. I stood there in my living room, holding my phone like it might suddenly spring to life with answers, when I heard what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor upstairs. Not the casual rearranging kind of sound, but slow, deliberate scraping that made my teeth hurt. The candles flickered, probably from me walking past them too quickly, but in that moment it felt like the whole apartment was holding its breath. Then came the knock, not from upstairs but from my front door. 3 solid raps that made me jump hard enough to knock over my glass of water on the coffee table. I crept toward the door, avoiding the squeaky floorboard near the kitchen, and looked through the peephole, but the hallway was pitch black. Not even the emergency exit sign was working. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady, but it came out thin and shaky. No response. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for breathing, movement, anything. But there was nothing except the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. My neighbor across the hall, Mrs. Gonzalez, usually kept her TV on until midnight. But tonight there was no muffled sound of game shows or telenovelas bleeding through the walls. The whole building felt abandoned, like everyone had evacuated except me. I backed away from the door, grabbed the biggest knife from my kitchen drawer, the one I'd bought for cutting watermelons but never actually used, and sat on my couch facing the entrance. 5 minutes passed, then 10, and I started to think maybe I'd imagined it, or it was just someone at the wrong apartment, confused in the darkness. That's when my phone finally gave up, the screen going black just as I was trying to dial 911, leaving me with no way to call for help. The footsteps upstairs started again, but now they were moving in circles, around and around, like someone was looking for something they'd dropped. I could track their path by the creaking, living room, bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, then back to the living room over and over in the same pattern. My candles were burning low, maybe an hour of light left if I was lucky, and I started calculating how long until sunrise, trying to remember if it was closer to 6 or 6:30 this time of year. Then I heard something that made every muscle in my body tense up. The sound of my doorknob turning, slowly, testing to see if it was locked. Thank God I'd gotten into the habit of deadbolting it after that creepy delivery guy incident last month. The knob turned back and forth a few more times, more aggressive now, and then stopped. I held that knife so tight my knuckles ached, staring at the door, waiting. The footsteps upstairs had stopped too, and for a moment everything was completely still, like the building itself was waiting to see what would happen next. A new sound broke the silence, faint knocking coming from above. Not like someone at a door, but like knuckles against the floor, right above where I was sitting. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, directly over my head as if someone was lying on the floor up there, tapping down at me. I moved to the kitchen, and after a few seconds, the knocking followed, staying right above me. When I stepped into my bedroom, it followed there too, tracking my movements perfectly through the ceiling. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone had broken into 5B. Maybe they were on drugs or having some kind of episode. But how could they know exactly where I was in the dark? The knocking grew louder, more insistent, and then it hit me like ice water in my veins. Whoever was up there had been in my apartment before, knew the layout, knew which floorboards lined up with which rooms below. The realization made me want to throw up, and I had to lean against the wall to steady myself. I decided to make a run for it, grab my keys and get out, sleep in my car if I had to. Anything was better than staying here. But as I rushed toward the hallway where I'd left my purse, I heard something that stopped me cold. Footsteps inside my apartment, in my bedroom, even though I was standing in the living room. Not possible, I thought. I would have heard someone come in, but there it was. The unmistakable sound of my closet door sliding open, the one that always stuck and made that specific grinding noise. My bedroom was only 15 feet away, but it might as well have been a mile. The footsteps moved around in there, unhurried, like someone familiar with the space, opening drawers, moving things around. I stood frozen in my living room, that knife still in my hand but feeling completely useless, as I heard my jewelry box open. The one that played that tiny melody when you lifted the lid, a gift from my grandmother that I'd kept even though I never wore jewelry anymore. The melody played out completely, all 20 seconds of it, and then I heard whistling. Someone in my bedroom was whistling along to the tune, getting every note perfect like they'd heard it 100 times before. My legs finally responded and I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the deadbolt in the dark, my fingers slippery with sweat. Behind me, the footsteps left my bedroom, moving down the hallway toward me, not running but walking steadily, confidently. The deadbolt finally turned and I yanked the door open, ready to scream for help. But standing in my doorway was Frank, holding a flashlight that wasn't turned on, wearing his usual maintenance uniform, but with something wrong about his expression. Too calm, too pleased. "Going somewhere?" he asked, and his voice had this strange quality to it, like he was trying not to laugh. Behind me, the footsteps from my bedroom had stopped, and when I glanced back, there was nobody there, just my empty hallway and the dying candlelight flickering from the living room. "Frank, someone's in my apartment," I whispered, my voice barely working. He tilted his head, that weird, almost smile still on his face, and took a step forward, forcing me to step back into my apartment. "Nobody's here but us," he said, pulling something from his pocket. A key ring with way too many keys, jangling them slowly. "Checked all the units during the blackout, making sure everyone's safe. Found some interesting things in 5B though. Mr. Garrett left some furniture behind, had to move it around to check the windows." He stepped inside fully now, closing my door behind him with his foot. "Funny thing about these old buildings," he continued, walking past me into my living room like he owned the place. "The maintenance tunnels between floors. Most people don't even know they exist. Perfect for checking pipes, electrical work, moving between units without using the hallways." My brain was screaming at me to run, but he was between me and the door now, still jangling those keys, and I realized one of them was labeled 4D, my apartment. "Been checking on you for months," Frank said, sitting down on my couch like we were old friends catching up. "You know, after your divorce, living alone, thought you might need someone looking after you. That ex-husband of yours, real piece of work, calling here asking about you. Wanting to know if you had any male visitors. Told him you were doing just fine on your own." He picked up my book from the coffee table, flipping through it casually. "You should really vary your routine though. Chinese food every Friday, library every Saturday morning, grocery store Sunday afternoons. Makes it too easy for the wrong people to know when you're home." The knife was still in my hand, hidden behind my back, and I was calculating if I could make it to the bathroom, lock myself in, maybe break the window and scream for help. But Frank seemed to read my mind, standing up and positioning himself between me and the hallway. "The bathroom window's been painted shut since last winter, remember? You put in a maintenance request about it, but I never got around to fixing it. Lot of things in this building I never quite get around to fixing." Something in me snapped then. Maybe it was anger overtaking the fear or just pure survival instinct. But I brought that knife forward and pointed it at him. "Get out of my apartment right now or I'll scream so loud the whole building will hear." Frank actually laughed, a genuine amused sound that made my skin prickle. "During a blackout? When half the building's empty because people went to stay with friends who have generators? Go ahead." But I did scream, loud and long, and to my surprise I heard doors opening in the hallway. Voices calling out, footsteps running. Frank's expression changed instantly, the smugness replaced with something like panic. Turns out Mrs. Gonzalez hadn't evacuated after all, and neither had the college kids from 4F. Within seconds there were people pounding on my door, asking if I was okay, threatening to call the cops. Frank tried to play it off, opening the door with his master key, telling everyone he was just checking on residents during the blackout. But Mrs. Gonzalez wasn't buying it. She pushed past him, grabbed my arm, and pulled me into the hallway, announcing loudly that I was staying with her tonight, and that somebody better call the police right now because Frank had no business being in a young woman's apartment at this hour. The police arrived within 20 minutes. Apparently, the college kids had managed to get through to 911 on their phone. When they searched Frank's apartment in the basement, they found a whole collection of things that made my stomach turn. A notebook with detailed schedules of female residents, copies of keys he wasn't supposed to have, and photos taken through apartment windows. The real kicker was when they checked the maintenance tunnels he'd mentioned. There were makeshift platforms between floors where he could access certain apartments through ventilation grates he'd modified. He'd been doing this for years, apparently, but most residents who'd complained about strange noises or things being moved had been dismissed as paranoid or had simply moved out. The police found my spare key in his pocket, the one I thought I'd lost at the laundromat 3 months ago. They also discovered he'd installed tiny holes in the ceiling of my apartment, barely visible, that lined up with the floor of 5B, which explained how he could track my movements so precisely from above. Frank was arrested that night, charged with stalking, breaking, and entering, and a bunch of other things my lawyer later explained to me. I moved out the next week, stayed with my sister in Pasadena until I could find a new place. The other women in the building filed a joint lawsuit against the property management company for failing to properly screen their employees. Turns out Frank had been fired from 2 previous buildings for similar complaints that were never formally investigated. I still have trouble sleeping sometimes, especially during power outages, and I always check my ceilings for any unusual holes or marks. But Mrs. Gonzalez was right about one thing she told me that night while we waited for the police. Trust your instincts, mija. If something feels wrong, it probably is. I just wish I'd trusted mine sooner. These days I live in a building with multiple security cameras, electronic locks that track every entry, and most importantly, no maintenance tunnels between floors. And I never, ever ignore footsteps in the night. No one ever stays past 9 on the 12th floor, but I had a deadline and thought I could finish a few more pages before heading home. The office was almost silent except for the hum of the old fluorescent lights and the occasional passing siren from the streets below. It was late autumn, the kind of night where the air outside looks sharp, the windows fog from the inside, and the city feels strangely hollow. My name's Claire, and at that time I was 26, working as a junior analyst for a small architectural firm tucked between 2 glass towers in downtown Chicago. The company wasn't glamorous, but I liked the rhythm. Late nights, empty hallways, the steady calm of a city that never truly sleeps. When the clock hit 9:47, I packed my bag and sent one last email before heading to the elevator. The building had that corporate stillness that always made me uneasy after hours. Even the air conditioning sounded unsure of itself. The elevator button glowed faintly when I pressed it, reflecting off the metal panel. I remember glancing at my phone, 11% battery, before stepping inside. It was one of those older elevators with a dull brass railing and a carpet that had seen better decades. The doors closed, sealing me in with the faint scent of old wiring and cleaning chemicals. The elevator jolted as it began to descend, a sluggish mechanical groan echoing through the shaft. I leaned against the wall, half thinking about ordering a ride-share home, half thinking about the eerie silence that had swallowed the building. Then it happened. Everything went black. The hum of the elevator died mid-motion. For a second, I thought it was a simple flicker, a surge maybe, but the silence that followed was absolute. No motion, no light. Just the faint echo of metal cooling around me. My phone's screen lit up when I unlocked it, the only blue glow in the suffocating dark. I tapped the emergency button. Nothing. No buzz, no click. I tried the call button next, but it was dead too. The air felt heavy, like the elevator itself was holding its breath. I checked my phone again, 8%. No signal. That was when I first heard it. A faint tapping sound echoing from below. So soft I almost convinced myself it was just the cables shifting. It came in intervals, spaced out evenly, like someone was testing a rhythm on the metal. I told myself it was the building settling, but each time I whispered hello, the tapping stopped, then started again, a little closer. I called out again, louder this time, but my voice felt like it got swallowed by the dark. The tapping stopped. The air around me thickened with silence, so complete that I could hear the faint ticking of my wristwatch. I held my phone up, trying to use the dim light to see the ceiling vent. The metal above me seemed endless, a narrow throat of shadows. When the sound returned, it came from somewhere higher, not below anymore, but closer to the top of the shaft. It was deliberate now, each strike echoing longer than the last, like something metallic brushing along the walls, dragging itself closer inch by inch. I thought about forcing the doors open, but my legs wouldn't move at first. I kept telling myself it had to be maintenance workers trying to fix the power, but that lie didn't hold up when I heard what sounded like knuckles. Slow, precise knocks tracing the edges of the elevator roof. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more, each one measured, patient. I whispered again, "Is someone there?" This time the sound answered immediately. 1 sharp tap in return. Not random, not cables. Someone was listening. The darkness plays tricks on the mind. I started remembering things that didn't belong to that moment. Old stories about people trapped underground. Rescue workers who heard voices that shouldn't exist. My breathing grew uneven, and I tried to steady it by counting in my head. Every time I hit 5, another tap interrupted, syncing itself to my rhythm like it was mocking me. I held the phone tighter, its glow barely enough to see my fingers, battery at 5%. My reflection on the metal door was just a blur, a faint outline that seemed to twitch with every flicker of light. Then came a different sound. The faint creak of metal from above, followed by a low scraping noise, almost like something being dragged. I lifted my phone toward the ceiling, squinting. For half a second I thought I saw movement behind the vent, something shifting in the slats, just enough to catch the light before disappearing. My throat went dry. I stepped back, pressed against the wall, and tried not to make a sound. The elevator gave a subtle shudder, like it was reacting to something heavy settling on top of it. The elevator lights blinked once, just enough to show the dust swirling in the air, then died again. I gripped the railing, listening. The sound above shifted, not just tapping now, but faint scraping, as if something metallic was tracing slow circles across the roof. I tried shouting for help again, and my own voice came back distorted, bouncing off the shaft in ways that made it sound like several people were whispering the same words back at me. I hit the emergency panel again, even though I knew it was useless. Each button gave a hollow click under my fingers, but nothing lit up. A thin draft pushed through the ceiling vent, cold enough to sting my face. It carried the faintest smell of burnt plastic and oil, like an engine overheating somewhere nearby. Then came another sound, short, clipped breaths, followed by a whisper that might have been my name. I didn't want to believe that. Maybe I was hearing the wind or the echo of the cables. I backed into the corner and watched the narrow vent above me, my phone light trembling across the edges. The air seemed to hum now, like a low vibration buried beneath the silence. When the elevator shook again, it wasn't random. It moved just once, a single deliberate drop of a few inches before halting. The cables groaned under the weight, and that sound from the roof, the dragging metal, stopped completely. For a moment there was only stillness. Then a single knock came from directly above my head, followed by another, slower one on the wall beside me. I pressed my ear against the cold surface and heard something slide downward, a noise so close it felt like it was tracing my outline through the steel. I yelled for anyone in the maintenance room, anyone in the building, even the security guard I'd seen earlier at the lobby desk. Nothing came back. The air felt warmer suddenly, as if the walls were breathing with me. My phone dimmed to 1%, and the blue light barely reached the corners of the elevator. The next sound wasn't tapping or scraping. It was a quiet laugh. Not loud or mocking, just a low, broken chuckle that stopped as soon as I lifted my head. That was the last thing I heard before the light finally died. When the light vanished, I thought I'd gone deaf too. The silence wasn't empty, it was dense, pressing against my ears, making every breath feel like it belonged to someone else. I slid down the wall, clutching the phone that had become useless. My heartbeat filled the space, fast and uneven. I waited for the tapping to return, for anything to break the stillness, but the dark stayed whole. Minutes, maybe hours passed like that. I had no way of knowing. The air tasted metallic, and I could hear faint pops from the elevator's wiring cooling off. Every sound became a question. Was it me or something else? When the elevator finally moved, it was so sudden I barely had time to react. It jerked once, then began descending again, slow but steady. The lights didn't come back, but I could feel motion, that subtle pull under my feet that made my stomach tighten. Somewhere far below, I could hear the faint hum of generators. I thought I was being rescued. I remember crying out, "Hello, can anyone hear me?" No answer. The tapping didn't return either. Only the mechanical groans of the shaft as the elevator crawled downward, stopping with a gentle bump. The doors slid open into complete darkness. No lobby lights, no emergency lamps, not even the glow of street lights through the glass. I stepped out carefully, hands brushing against the cold marble wall until I found the main hallway. The building was dead silent. My shoes clicked against the floor, echoing back at me, but something about the echo wasn't right. It came a second too late, like it was chasing me. I walked faster until I reached the glass entrance. Outside, the city was pitch black. Every building, every sign, every light, gone. Only the red sky above, faint and unnatural, lit by something distant. When power finally returned, I was sitting on the curb outside, surrounded by flashing emergency lights and strangers who'd gathered from nearby buildings. No one else had been trapped in an elevator that night. When I told a firefighter what I'd heard, the knocking, the voice, the sound above, he said it was probably pressure from the cables, the kind of thing panic makes worse. But even as he spoke, I kept watching the elevator doors through the glass. They opened once more, just slightly as if breathing. Something metallic shifted inside. And for a brief moment, I swore I heard that slow, rhythmic tapping again. One last time. The night the power grid failed across Florida, I had just started what should have been a calm 12-hour shift. My name's Aaron, and at that time I was the only nurse on duty in the ICU wing of a small coastal hospital. Most of the staff had gone home early because of the storm warnings. The air was thick and heavy, pressing against the windows like it wanted in. The lights flickered twice, and then the entire world outside the glass went dark. I remember standing by the monitors, hearing every machine sigh as the power cut out, and for a second, it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. The generator kicked in after a few seconds, buzzing from somewhere deep in the lower floors. The relief that washed over me was short-lived. The hum sounded strained, almost sick. We had 3 patients on life support that night: an older man recovering from heart surgery, a woman in a coma after a car accident, and a teenage boy with severe asthma complications. Their lives hung on those machines, and suddenly, I became the only thing standing between them and silence. An hour passed before the temperature began to climb. Without full ventilation, the ICU started to feel like an oven. The walls seemed to radiate heat. I tried calling the emergency line, the maintenance team, anyone. Nothing. Every call ended in static. I told myself help was on the way, that power crews were out there fixing things. But then the generator coughed once, twice, and went quiet. The machines followed one after another, their beeps stretching into a flat, suffocating line. That silence was like gravity, thick and absolute. I could hear my own heartbeat, the shallow rasp of the old man's breathing, and something else, faint but rhythmic. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing down the main corridor. I thought maybe it was security coming to check on me, but the sound stopped right outside the ICU doors. I waited for them to open. They never did. I stayed by the door for a long moment, waiting for whoever was out there to say something. Nothing came through the glass, no shadow, no whisper, just that faint echo dying away in the hallway. The backup lights in the ceiling were out, so I grabbed my small penlight and aimed it toward the corridor. The beam reached only a few feet before being swallowed by darkness. I told myself it could be the pipes expanding in the heat or a cart rolling on its own, but it did not sound mechanical. It sounded human, someone pacing just beyond the door, stopping when I moved. When I turned back to the patients, sweat had soaked through my scrubs. The temperature kept climbing, and the air felt thick enough to choke on. I went through the supply room and found 3 portable oxygen tanks, 2 nearly full, 1 less than half. I lined them on the counter and stared at them for a long time. I had always trusted protocols, flowcharts, supervision, but there was none of that now. The emergency radio was silent, and the backup power room was several floors down. Every minute that passed meant less air for the people who could not ask for it. I decided to start with the boy. His chest barely moved, and without the ventilator, his breathing sounded fragile, like paper crumpling. I attached one of the full tanks to his mask and watched the line of his pulse steady. The old man was gasping quietly, his skin turning gray. I gave him the second tank, adjusting the flow as I had done hundreds of times before. The woman in the coma did not move at all, but her monitor showed faint electrical flickers, a heartbeat trying to stay alive. I stared at the last half-empty tank and felt my throat close up. Somewhere down the hallway, something metal clattered to the floor. It was distant but sharp, echoing through the hollow corridors. I stepped outside the ICU for a moment, shining the penlight down the empty stretch. The hospital had never felt so enormous. Wheelchairs, carts, and gurneys stood frozen in the dark, their shapes distorted by the faint red glow of emergency exit signs. The smell of antiseptic mixed with heat made me dizzy. Then, from the far end, came the slow scrape of a shoe on tile. Once, then again, deliberate, like someone dragging their feet toward me. The scraping stopped halfway down the hall, and the air seemed to thicken with every second that passed. I whispered a name, just a reflex asking if anyone was there, but only the hum of the emergency lights answered me. The idea of leaving the patients alone terrified me more than whatever might be walking those corridors. I stepped back inside and locked the ICU door, though I doubted the thin latch would stop much. The generator room came to mind again, but the thought of navigating that dark maze alone made my stomach knot. I sat between the beds, the small beam of my penlight trembling across the walls, waiting for a sound that would tell me what to do. Hours blurred together. The oxygen gauges kept falling, and I could not shake the thought that rescue crews might never come. I rotated the tanks as best I could, giving each patient bursts of air, counting the seconds under my breath. When I pressed my ear against the wall, I could hear the faint pulse of the storm outside. Rain, wind, and maybe distant sirens too far to matter. Then the footsteps came again, slower, heavier, as if whoever it was had learned the rhythm of my movements and matched them. When the boy's oxygen ran out, his pulse line began to flatten. I tried to ration what little was left from the half-empty tank, but it only delayed the inevitable. His last breath came out as a faint whistle, and then the silence returned, deeper this time, heavier. I do not remember crying. I remember only the sound of metal turning at the ICU handle. Someone was trying to get in. I shouted that the door was locked, that I was inside with patients, but there was no response. Just the sound of the handle twitching, slow, measured, like testing the strength of the lock. Then it stopped. By sunrise, the power returned with a jolt that made every machine scream back to life. The building flooded with blinding fluorescent light, and I realized I was sitting on the floor, clutching the empty oxygen tank. The boy was gone, the other 2 still alive. When the maintenance team finally reached the ICU, they told me no one else had been in the building that night. Every entrance was sealed, and security cameras had been down since the blackout began. I transferred to another hospital soon after, but every time the lights flicker now, I hear those footsteps again, slow, patient, and waiting.